A snow leopard is walking across the plains of Rohan. He has no horse. He needs none. 3 riders spot him first. By the time they reach him, one of them is already dead. This is not a beast. This is not a demon either, though the men of the mark will call him one before the week is out. This is Tai Lung, once the greatest warrior the Valley of Peace ever raised, denied the one thing he believed was owed to him, and cast out for the crime of wanting it. Tonight, something tore open the sky above Middle-earth, and it spat him out onto a battlefield that hasn't even started fighting him yet. Gondor will send scouts. Rohan will send soldiers. The elves will send something older and far more careful. And Mordor will send an offer. He does not know these lands. He does not know their war. He only knows one thing for certain. No one tells Tai Lung what he is anymore. This is Galaxy Lore Untold, and this is the story of what happens when the hardest fighter in the Valley of Peace lands in the middle of the War of the Ring, with no master, no leash, and no side. Written for you by James Perrell. If you've got a what if you're dying to see, drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Hit subscribe, ring that bell, because you do not want to miss where this goes. For half a second, the sky over the eastern plains of Rohan simply bled. A seam of raw white light opening low over the grass, jagged at the edges like a wound cauterized as it formed. And out of it came a shape traveling faster than anything should travel, trailing a scream of displaced air behind it like a wake. Tai Lung hit the ground on all fours, claws raking 6 furrows into the turf as he skidded to a stop, and the light above him sealed shut with a sound like a held breath finally released. Silence, wind, grass, the smell of horse dung and wood smoke somewhere on the air, and underneath it something colder. Old stone, old blood, a land that had been fighting for longer than he'd been alive. He rose slowly out of the crouch, vertebrae popping back into alignment, and looked around at a horizon he did not recognize. No red pagoda roofs, no terraced rice paddies climbing green hills, no familiar mountains cupping a valley he'd once have died to rule. Just grass, endless and rippling gold-green under a sky the wrong shade of blue, and far off, miles off, a line of low hills crowned with something that might have been a fortress, pale stone catching the last of a dying afternoon. He flexed the claws on his right hand, still there, still sharp, the chi that had torn him out of his own world, out of the crater beneath the Jade Palace steps where he'd finally held the dragon scroll in his hands and unrolled it to find nothing there but his own reflection mocking him. That chi was still coiled tight under his skin, humming, unspent. Whatever had happened, whatever had opened beneath him and swallowed him whole, it hadn't taken anything from him. He could feel that immediately, the way a fighter feels the weight of his own fists before he's thrown a single punch. Good. He didn't know where he was. He didn't know what waited past those hills. But he knew, with the same absolute certainty that had carried him through 20 years of imprisonment without breaking, that whatever this new world thought it knew about strength, it hadn't met him yet. He started walking. The Rohirrim patrol found him 4 hours later, at dusk, when the grass had gone the color of dried blood under a bruised sky. There were 6 of them, riding the low ridge that marked the boundary of the East Mark, spears at rest, the kind of routine patrolmen rode 100 times without incident, and then, on the 101st time, rode into something that ended their lives. Their leader was a broad-shouldered rider named Théoden, second son of a minor thane, 23 years old and 3 years a soldier, and he saw the shape on the plain below and reined in so hard his horse screamed. "Hold!" he said, and the word came out thinner than he wanted. The others pulled up beside him, 6 horses, snorting, ears flat, already unsettled before their riders understood why. Below them, walking alone across open ground with no horse, no cart, no visible weapon, was something that should not exist. Upright, built like a man but wrong in every particular, too much muscle stacked in too little frame, a tail sweeping low behind it, a face that was neither beast nor man but some third thing entirely, moving with a fluid, coiled economy that made every soldier's spine go cold on instinct before their minds caught up with the reason why. "Orc work," muttered one of the younger riders, "some new making of the enemy. Orcs don't walk like that, Théoden said. He'd fought orcs. Orcs came in packs, hunched and snarling, ugly with hate. This thing moved like still water. It hadn't looked up at them yet, and somehow that was worse, as if it already knew they were there and simply hadn't decided they mattered. He made his choice the way his father had taught him to make choices, quickly and without apology. Fan out, spears low. We don't attack first, but by the mark we don't let it pass unquestioned either. He raised his voice, pitched to carry across the grass. You there, stand and be known. Tai Lung stopped walking. He turned his head, unhurried, and looked up at 6 mounted men silhouetted on the ridge above him, spears catching the last light, horses stamping and blowing with fear their riders were fighting to master. He read the shape of it in half a second. 6 against 1, higher ground, disciplined enough to hold formation instead of charging in a panic. Not the worst force he'd ever faced. Not close. Stand and be known, Théoden called again, walking his horse 2 steps down the slope, spear leveled. This is the mark of Rohan. Name yourself, or what? The voice came out low, flat, entirely unbothered, and it carried farther than a voice that quiet had any right to carry. Théoden's horse shied sideways at the sound of it. Not the words, just the sound. Something in the register that some old animal part of every horse on that ridge recognized as predator and screamed at its rider to run. Or we take you, Théoden said, steadying his mount with a hard hand. By force if we must. Tai Lung actually smiled at that. It wasn't a friendly expression. You could try. Théoden had led men into 3 skirmishes in 3 years, and never once frozen. He didn't freeze now. He dropped his spear tip and dug his heels in, and behind him 5 more riders followed, because that was what discipline meant. You moved when your leader moved. You trusted the line to hold. It was, Tai Lung reflected later, almost impressive. For men on horses with sticks. The first spear came in low and fast, aimed at his chest with real skill behind the throw of the rider's weight, and Tai Lung didn't dodge so much as arrive somewhere the spear wasn't. A half step, a turn of the hip, the kind of motion that looked slow until you tried to track where he'd actually gone, and found your eyes a half second behind reality. His hand closed on the spear's shaft as it passed him, and he used the rider's own momentum to rip both spear and rider sideways out of the saddle. The man hit the ground hard enough to lose his breath in one ragged cough, and Tai Lung was already moving toward the second rider before the first had finished falling. This was the part of Rohan's world that hadn't caught up yet, the part where 6 trained soldiers on horseback, armed and armored, represented an overwhelming advantage against a single unmounted opponent. It was a good rule. It had held for centuries against orcs and wild men, and every manner of threat these plains had ever produced. It had never accounted for something that moved the way 20 years of prison-forged obsession and a lifetime of martial discipline could make a body move. The second rider swung his sword in a wide arc meant to open Tai Lung's throat, and Tai Lung ducked under it. Not a flinch, a deliberate drop of the whole body's center of gravity, controlled and total, and came up inside the man's guard with an open palm strike to the chest that sent him backward off his horse, like he'd been struck by a felled tree. Ribs cracked. The man didn't get up. To me, Théoden shouted, wheeling his horse, trying to reform some kind of perimeter, trying to remember every drill about facing an unmounted foe with cavalry. Surround. Don't engage singly. Use the horse's speed to control range. Tai Lung didn't give him the time. He closed the distance to the third rider in 3 strides that shouldn't have covered that ground that fast, caught the horse's bridle in one clawed hand, and stopped 1,400 pounds of charging animal cold. Not gently, not without cost to the horse, but he stopped it, and the rider went over the animal's neck and into the dirt. By the time Théoden understood the shape of what he was facing, 2 more of his men were down, and the third horse was screaming and rearing, and the calculus of 6 against 1 had already collapsed into something closer to 1 against none. Fall back, Théoden bellowed, finally. the order coming 100 heartbeats too late to save the shape of his patrol's dignity, but perhaps in time to save what remained of their lives. "Fall back to the outpost. Ride," 2 riders obeyed. The rest were on the ground, one of them not moving at all. The second man, Halbjorn, chest caved in from a strike that had been thrown with less restraint than the others, because he'd swung his sword at Tai Lung's face, and Tai Lung had decided, in the half-second it took to process that this one didn't get the courtesy of a broken rib instead of a broken sternum. Tai Lung stood in the settling dust and watched the surviving riders flee toward the darkening horizon, hoofbeats fading, and did not chase them. There was no point. He'd made his statement. The message would travel faster mounted than he could carry it on foot, and that suited him fine. He looked down at the man he'd killed. Human, young, features slack in death, blood pooling dark in the trampled grass beneath him. He felt nothing particularly, not triumph, not remorse. The boy had come at him with a blade aimed to kill, and in the world Tai Lung came from, that math had only ever gone one direction. He'd been fighting people who wanted him dead since before this boy had been born, in whatever years passed here. Being surprised by a corpse was a luxury he'd given up a long time ago. Somewhere in the dark of Chorgom prison, listening to his own heartbeat for 2 decades, and promising himself that the next hand raised against him would be the last mistake its owner made. He turned from the bodies and kept walking toward the pale fortress on the hills, because standing still in the open, waiting for a larger response, struck him as the kind of mistake a lesser fighter made. He wanted to see what this land sent next. He wanted, if he was honest with the coiled and hungry thing under his ribs, for it to be something that could actually make him work. Éomer received the news 3 hours after moonrise, in the long hall at Edoras, from a rider still white-faced and shaking, who had covered the distance from the eastern outpost, at a pace that had nearly killed his horse. 4 dead or as good as, the rider reported, kneeling, voice cracking on the number. 1 creature, no mount, no visible weapon but its own hands, and it, my lord, it moved faster than I've seen anything move. Théoden ordered the retreat himself, and even that cost us. Éomer, 3rd Marshal of the Rittermark, sat very still in the flickering torchlight, and turned the report over in his mind, the way a man turns over a stone he doesn't like the look of. "A creature," he said slowly. "Describe it again. Precisely. Man-shaped, my lord, but a beast's face. Some great cat, white and gray, black markings, a tail. It walked upright, spoke plainly. Western, my lord, clear as you or I, and fought like nothing I have ever seen. Not orc strength, not troll strength. Something else. Something that knew exactly what it was doing with every motion." Éomer's jaw tightened. He had fought orcs since he was old enough to hold a blade, had ridden against wild men and worse things that crept out of Fangorn's shadow, and in all of it, in all his years, he had never once heard an account that unsettled him this precisely. Not because it described overwhelming force, but because it described skill, discipline. A single creature that had dismantled 6 trained riders and walked away without apparent injury. Where is it now? Walking, my lord. Toward Edoras, as best we could tell, before we broke and rode. Toward Edoras, not fleeing, not raiding. Walking toward the seat of Rohan's power, alone, unhurried, as though it had already decided the outcome of whatever confrontation waited at the end of that road. Éomer rose from his seat. "Wake the garrison," he said, quietly. "I'll not have Edoras in a panic over 1 creature before we've even seen the shape of the threat with our own eyes. Send word to King Théoden's chambers that I request his ear at first light, and send a rider to Aragorn, if he can be found. He has walked stranger roads than any of us and seen stranger things. If this is something new under the sun, I want more than a frightened boy's account before I decide how the mark answers it." The rider bowed and hurried out. Éomer stood alone a moment longer in the guttering torchlight, staring at nothing, turning the description over again. A beast's face, fought like nothing I have ever seen. Middle-earth had weathered orcs and trolls and the growing shadow in the east for age upon age. It had a shape for every horror it had ever faced, a name and a lineage and a place in the old lore. This had no shape yet, no name, no lineage anyone in this hall could place. That, Éomer thought, grimly saddling his own horse an hour later to ride out and see the truth of it himself, was precisely what worried him most. Tai Lung reached the outer fields around Edoras a little before dawn and stood on a low rise looking at the golden hall crowning the hill above the town. Firelight glowing warm through its high windows, banners hanging still in the windless dark, the whole structure sitting up there like something that had survived a great many things and expected to survive whatever came next. He could smell wood smoke, livestock, unwashed crowds of humanity packed close together behind a wooden palisade. A whole civilization built up around this hill, none of it aware yet of what was standing at its edge. Somewhere behind him, he knew, riders would be gathering. The survivors' report would have reached whoever ran this place by now, and men who ran places like this didn't ignore reports of 4 dead soldiers. More would come. Soldiers, probably. Maybe something more interesting than soldiers. He found a flat stone at the top of the rise, and he sat, and he waited. The way he'd waited 20 years in the dark for a scroll that turned out to hold nothing at all. He was good at waiting. He was better, now, at what came after. The eastern sky was beginning to pale toward gray when he heard hoofbeats. A single rider this time, moving at a controlled canter rather than a frightened gallop. Someone coming to look rather than someone running away. Tai Lung didn't stand. He watched the horizon and let the rider come to him, because that was what you did when you wanted the other side to understand, from the very first moment, exactly whose ground they were standing on. Éomer rode out alone, against the counsel of every officer who'd tried to stop him. You do not know what it is, his captain, Elfhelm, had argued in the courtyard, both of them mounting in the gray pre-dawn light. Take a company, take 10 men. 10 men accomplished nothing last night but dying, Éomer said, swinging up into the saddle. If this thing wanted Edoras burned, it would not be sitting on a hillside waiting for company. It wants to be seen. So I will see it, and it will see a man riding alone, unafraid, asking for words instead of blood. If that fails, then send your company, and Théoden's wrath with it. He rode out through the gate before Elfhelm could argue further, spear left behind, only his sword at his hip, and his horse Firefoot beneath him. And the whole way across the dew-heavy grass he turned the risk over in his mind, and found he could not make it come out any safer than it already was. Something that could put down 6 riders without a scratch would put down 60 the same way, if it wanted to. The only tool Éomer actually had was the choice of how to begin, and he had decided, somewhere in that long night of turning the rider's report over and over, that beginning with an army would only guarantee the fight that everyone was hoping to avoid. He saw the shape on the rise from a quarter-mile off, sitting, still, watching him approach with the unhurried patience of something that had already decided how this would go. Éomer reined in 30 yards out, close enough for words, far enough to give himself room to react, and did not reach for his sword. "You're the one who killed 4 of my riders," he said. No preamble, no softness. If this creature respected strength, it would respect a man who didn't waste its time. Tai Lung's gold eyes tracked him without blinking. "I'm the one who killed one of your riders. The others fell off their horses and lived to complain about it. If you want to call broken ribs and bruised pride a death, your soldiers are softer than I took them for. One is still one too many, in a land at war already." Éomer kept his voice level, though something in him wanted to bristle at the casual dismissal. "I am Éomer, 3rd Marshal of the Mark of Rohan. You stand on land that answers to my king. I would know your name, and the reason you walked onto it swinging killing blows at men who only asked you to stand and be known. They came at me with spears first, Tai Lung rose from the stone, unfolding to his full height in one smooth motion that made Firefoot shift nervously beneath his rider. I don't remember being asked anything. I remember being surrounded and told to name myself or be taken. Where I come from, that's not a question. That's a threat with better manners. Éomer held his ground, though his hand had drifted, almost without his willing it, closer to his sword hilt. This is a land at war, stranger. A creature answering to no banner, appearing from nowhere, matching that description. You'll forgive men on patrol for treating it as danger first and diplomacy second. I'll forgive it, Tai Lung said, and there was something almost amused in his voice now, because I don't need anyone's forgiveness to walk where I please. But you can tell your king this much for free. I didn't come from anywhere he's ever heard of, and I didn't come here to burn his hall down. Not yet, anyway. I came here because something tore a hole in the world and threw me through it, and I have exactly two things I care about right now. Finding out where I actually am, and finding someone worth fighting who won't die from a single open-handed strike. Éomer studied him for a long moment, the coiled economy of his stance, the utter absence of fear in a creature that had just admitted to killing a man without particular remorse, the strange dignity underneath the arrogance. This was not a beast. Beasts didn't negotiate terms. Beasts didn't have complaints about the quality of their opposition. You speak like a soldier, Éomer said finally, or a warrior of some order I don't recognize. I was the greatest warrior my land ever raised. No hesitation in the claim, no boast in the delivery. Just flat fact, the way a man states his own height. Trained from the time I could walk by a master who was the greatest teacher his order ever produced. I was promised a title, a destiny, the greatest honor my valley could bestow. Something shifted behind the gold eyes, brief and cold. I was denied it instead, for a reason that still doesn't sit right in my chest 20 years later. So don't lecture me about what a land at war does to men who feel they've been cheated of what's theirs. I imagine you've buried enough of your own to understand that particular arithmetic. It was, Éomer thought, an oddly honest answer from something that had killed one of his men 12 hours earlier. He found himself measuring it against everything he knew of pride and grievance and the men, human men, who let old wounds curdle into violence. This was not so different a shape for all its foreign face. What do I call you, Éomer asked, when I bring this account back to my king? Tai Lung. Tai Lung. Éomer turned the name over, unfamiliar on his tongue. And where is it you believe you've landed, Tai Lung, if not somewhere you recognize? That, Tai Lung said, is exactly what I'm hoping someone in that gold hall up there can tell me. Because right now, all I know is grass, and a fortress, and men who ride horses into fights they can't win. A faint, humorless curl at the edge of his mouth. I'm hoping your king is smarter than his soldiers. Éomer's jaw set. He could have answered the insult with steel. Some part of him wanted to. Pride stinging at the casual dismissal of men he'd trained and ridden beside for years. But he'd come out here to gather information, not to die proving a point, and everything about the last quarter hour told him that a duel here would end exactly as the skirmish on the plain had ended. You are on the land of the mark, he said instead, level and controlled. The realm of Rohan, kingdom of the horse lords, allied to Gondor, against the shadow that grows in Mordor to the east. If you seek a war worth fighting, stranger, you have landed in the middle of the largest one this age has seen. Whether you are friend, foe, or something the songs haven't found a word for yet, that is not mine to decide alone. That is for my king. Then take me to him. You expect me to walk you into Edoras after what you did to my riders? I expect, Tai Lung said, taking one unhurried step down the rise, close enough now that Firefoot's ears pinned flat and the horse fought the bit, that if your king is worth anything, he'll want to look at what tore a hole in his sky and decide for himself whether it's worth killing or worth using. Kings who send soldiers instead of showing up themselves usually aren't worth much. I'd like to find out which kind yours is. Éomer held Firefoot steady through sheer will and studied the creature in front of him, the confidence that bordered on contempt, and underneath it, if he looked carefully, something else. A kind of loneliness dressed up as arrogance, the specific hollow-eyed hunger of someone who had spent a very long time being told what he wasn't, and had built an entire self out of refusing to accept it. "Walk beside me then," Éomer said finally. "Not behind, not ahead, beside. And if you raise a hand against anyone inside those walls without cause, I promise you every archer on that palisade will loose at once, and even you cannot walk through that many arrows unscathed." "I've survived worse odds than a few farmers with bows," Tai Lung said, "but I'll walk beside you, for now. Let's see what your king has to say." The Hall of Meduseld was not what Tai Lung expected, though he could not have said what he'd expected instead. Golden light from a long central hearth fire threw shifting shadows up carved wooden pillars. Tapestries depicting men on horseback hung along the walls, faded with age. The whole space smelled of wood smoke and old stone, and the particular mustiness of a hall that had stood for generations and intended to stand for many more. Théoden King sat upon a high seat at the hall's far end, older than Tai Lung had pictured, silver-bearded, his face carrying the particular weariness of a man who had watched too many years of war grind down everything he loved. Beside him stood a slight, fair-haired woman with watchful pale eyes who did not look away from Tai Lung once, not for the length of the long walk up the hall's central aisle, not when Éomer made the formal introductions, not when the guards along the walls shifted their grips on their spears at the sight of him. "So," Théoden said, when Éomer had finished his account, and the hall had gone very still, "this is the creature that fell from the sky and killed one of my riders." "Your riders attacked first," Tai Lung said, before Éomer could answer for him. "I don't apologize for surviving an ambush." A ripple of tension moved through the guards along the walls. Théoden did not flinch, though his eyes narrowed with the particular calculation of a man who had spent 40 years learning to read threats before they fully declared themselves. "You come to my hall," the king said slowly, "unbowed, unrepentant, having killed one of my men, and you expect hospitality?" "I don't expect anything," Tai Lung said. "I came because your marshal said you might actually be worth talking to, instead of just another soldier throwing bodies at a problem he doesn't understand. So far, I'm not convinced either way." Éomer's hand tightened on his sword hilt, but it was the fair-haired woman beside the throne who spoke next, her voice cutting clean and cold across the hall. "You speak to the king of Rohan as though his patience is owed to you," she said. "It is not. Every man in this hall would see you cut down where you stand, were it not for the fact that my uncle wishes to understand you before he decides whether that mercy is deserved." Tai Lung turned his gold eyes on her, measuring, and found something there that surprised him. No fear in her stance, none of the wariness the guards along the walls wore like a second skin. Just cold, level assessment, the look of someone constantly underestimated and thoroughly tired of it. "And who," he asked, "are you?" "Éowyn," she said, "niece to the king, and no stranger to men, or beasts, who mistake a quiet room for a weak one." Something in Tai Lung's chest, some long-buried and half-forgotten thing, recognized the shape of that answer. He'd heard it before, in a different register, from a different mouth, the specific, brittle pride of someone who had spent their whole life being told what they weren't allowed to be. "I wasn't mistaking anything," he said, quieter now, some of the edge gone out of his voice. "I was asking." Théoden watched this exchange with the careful attention of a ruler who had survived a great many councils by knowing exactly when to let others draw out the shape of a threat before speaking himself. When he finally did speak, his voice carried the full weight of Rohan's long war behind it. "Here is what I understand," he said. "A creature falls from a tier in the sky, kills one soldier defending himself against an ambush he did not provoke, and walks unarmed into the heart of my kingdom to ask for an audience rather than to raise it. That is either the behavior of something remarkably foolish or something remarkably confident. I do not think you foolish, Tai Lung of, where was it you claimed to be from? Nowhere you'll have heard of. A valley. A different world entirely as far as I can tell. A different world, Théoden repeated, and something old and weary crossed his face. A king who had already seen wizards and walking trees and shadows out of legend made flesh, absorbing one more impossible thing onto an already impossible pile. Middle-earth has seen strange things in this age, stranger. Perhaps stranger than most kings would credit. But strange does not mean welcome, and confidence does not mean trust. You will tell me plainly, what do you want here? Tai Lung considered the question, and for the first time since he'd stepped through that tear in the sky, found he didn't have an easy answer ready. I don't know yet, he said finally. Where I came from, I wanted one thing my whole life. I finally got close enough to touch it, and it turned out to be worth nothing at all. So I don't know what I want here. I know I'm not interested in kneeling to anyone who hasn't earned it. I know I'm not interested in being anyone's weapon or anyone's monster, just because I don't look like the men in your tapestries. He glanced once around the hall, at the wary guards, at Éowyn's unflinching stare, at Éomer standing rigid by the door. Beyond that, I'm still working it out. Maybe your war has an answer in it somewhere, maybe it doesn't, but I didn't come here to burn your hall down, old man. If I wanted that, we wouldn't be talking. The silence that followed stretched long enough that the hearth fire's crackle became the loudest sound in the room. You may stay within Edoras, Théoden said at last, under watch and under my roof's law, until I have had time to send word to those with greater knowledge of far realms and stranger lore than mine. Elrond of Rivendell, perhaps, or the wizard Gandalf, should he cross our path again. You will not be my prisoner, but you will not walk unescorted through my kingdom either, not until I better understand what walked through that tear in the sky, and whether Rohan has gained a guest or an enemy it does not yet have the measure of. Tai Lung considered this, the offer, the terms, the careful dignity of a king who had neither groveled nor threatened, but simply weighed him honestly, the way so few had ever bothered to do. Fair enough, he said. For now, he didn't miss the way Éowyn's eyes tracked him as he was led from the hall, nor the particular calculating quality of that gaze, not fear, not quite admiration either, but something adjacent to both. Middle-earth, he was beginning to understand, was not going to simply take his measure and file him away as beast or weapon. It was going to keep watching. And somewhere out past the Golden Hall, past the plains and the mountains he hadn't seen yet, he suspected something far colder than a king's cautious welcome was already turning its attention toward the tear in the sky, and the thing that had crawled out of it. He was, if he let himself admit it, looking forward to finding out what that colder attention wanted. The room they gave him had no lock on the door, a detail Tai Lung noticed immediately, and understood immediately too. Not trust, strategy. A locked door was an insult that invited testing. An unlocked one, with 6 guards stationed in the corridor beyond, and more on the walls outside, made the same point without giving him anything to prove himself against. He respected it, in the grudging way he respected anything competently done. The chamber itself was carved stone and heavy timber, a straw pallet in one corner he had no intention of using, a single narrow window that looked east over the plains toward where the tear had opened. He spent the first hours simply moving through forms, slow, deliberate, the muscle memory of 2 decades discipline surfacing the way it always did when his mind had nothing better to occupy it. Strike, pivot, recover. Strike, pivot, recover. The guards outside the door went quiet listening to it, though he doubted they understood what they were hearing. Not violence rehearsed, but violence refined, sanded down to its purest and most economical form. He was 3 hours into that quiet discipline when he became aware of being watched. Not the guards, someone else, a presence at the window, careful and still, the specific quality of attention that belonged to someone used to observing without being observed in turn. He didn't break his form, he simply spoke, mid-motion, without turning his head. "You can come in, or you can keep standing on the wall outside my window pretending I can't hear you breathing. Either way works for me." A long pause. Then Éowyn's voice, unhurried, entirely unembarrassed at having been caught. "I wasn't hiding. I was deciding whether you were worth the climb. And? The jury's still out." She swung herself through the narrow window with a fighter's economy that told him everything he needed to know about how she'd spent her childhood, landing light on the stone floor and straightening her riding dress with an unhurried hand. "You fight like something built for it, not trained into it. Built. Both," Tai Lung said, finishing the form and letting his arms fall still at his sides. "Trained until it became the only thing I was." That sounds like a story with an unhappy ending. Most stories about being trained into the only thing you are. She studied him a moment, not with the wariness the guards wore, nor the careful neutrality Éomer had shown on the plain, but something closer to recognition, one hard-edged thing measuring another. "My uncle keeps me from riding to war," she said, apropos of nothing he'd asked. "Keeps me in this hall, keeps me safe, as though safety were a gift instead of a cage with better furniture. I've watched every man I love ride out to matter, and I've stayed behind to matter to no one at all." She tilted her head, gold light from the window catching pale hair. "I imagine you understand something about being told what you're not allowed to be." Tai Lung went very still. "That's a dangerous thing to say to something that killed one of your soldiers this morning." "I didn't say it because it was safe," Éowyn said. "I said it because it's true, and because you looked, for exactly one moment in that hall, like you might actually care whether it was true or not." He said nothing for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved across the plain, carrying the smell of horses and cook fires, and, underneath it, something colder that he couldn't yet place, a wrongness on the air that hadn't been there an hour ago. "You should go," he said finally, not unkindly, "before your uncle's guards find you climbing walls to talk to his prisoner. I go where I please in my own hall." But she moved toward the window anyway, some unspoken understanding passing between them that the conversation, whatever it had been, was finished for now. She paused with one leg already over the sill. "For what it's worth, I don't think you're a monster. I think you're something that's been made to believe it has to prove it isn't one, over and over, to people who'll never actually be convinced. I know the shape of that particular exhaustion." She was gone before he could answer, dropping lightly to the walkway below and vanishing around the curve of the hall, and Tai Lung stood alone at the window for a long moment afterward, turning her words over with the same careful attention he'd have given an opponent's unexpected opening. He did not like how close to true it had landed. The wrongness on the wind resolved itself an hour before sunset, and every soul in Edoras felt it at the same moment. A drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the season, a silence that spread outward from the eastern gate as birds went quiet and horses in the stables began to scream and kick against their stalls. Théoden was on his feet before the herald finished announcing it. "A rider," the man gasped, having run the length of the hall without pause for breath. "Black-cloaked, alone, come up from the east road. My lord, the horses will not go near it. The dogs will not go near it." "I know what it is," Théoden said, and his voice had gone gray as ash. "Ready the gate guard, send for Éomer, and someone find the stranger, Tai Lung, and bring him to the wall. If this is what I think it is, I want to see how it looks at him, and I want to see how he looks back." Tai Lung was already moving toward the sound of the commotion before the guard sent to fetch him had finished climbing the stairs to his chamber. He'd felt the shift in the air himself, the way every hair along his spine had risen at a wrongness he couldn't name but recognized instinctively as the presence of something built entirely out of fear itself, weaponized and given shape. He'd fought poison, he'd fought despair, in his own bones, for 20 years in the dark. This was cousin to both and worse than either. He reached the eastern wall as the Black Rider came into view on the road below. A tall, hooded shape astride a horse the color of an old bruise. moving at an unhurried walk that somehow conveyed more menace than any charge could have managed. The temperature dropped further with every yard it closed. Guards along the wall gripped their spears with white-knuckled hands and could not, meet the shadow beneath that hood. Tai Lung felt something old and cold brush against the edges of his mind. Not quite a voice, not quite a touch. A pressure testing for a door it assumed would open the way it always did, the way it had opened for 100 lesser wills, across 100 years of practiced despair. It found no door. He felt the moment the pressure registered its own failure, a strange, subtle recoil, like a hand pulling back from a stove it had expected to be cold. Whatever fear this thing was built to project simply had nowhere to land in him. He'd already spent 20 years alone in the absolute dark, listening to his own heartbeat, building a self entirely out of refusal. There was no room left in him for a stranger's borrowed dread. The Black Rider stopped at the base of the wall and looked up. No face visible, only shadow within the hood. And yet Tai Lung had the distinct and uncomfortable sense of being studied with real interest for the first time since he'd arrived in this world. "You are the one," the messenger said, and its voice arrived not quite through the air, but through something closer to bone, layered and wrong, that tore the seam. "I'm the one who fell through it," Tai Lung said, standing at the wall's edge, with his arms loose at his sides, entirely unhurried. "Not the same thing. My master felt it happen. A wound in the world, opening where no wound should be possible." The hooded head tilted, a gesture that managed to convey curiosity without any visible feature to convey it with. "He has looked for you since. He does not often look twice at anything. Tell him I'm flattered." No edge of fear in Tai Lung's voice at all, which was, Théoden observed from a few paces back along the wall, perhaps the single strangest thing about the entire encounter. He had watched grown men, hardened soldiers, blanch and stammer in the presence of a Nazgûl's voice, and this creature stood at the wall's edge, trading words with it like a man haggling over the price of grain. "My master does not offer flattery," the messenger continued. "He offers opportunity. You are strength unclaimed by any banner in this world, strength that owes no oath, bears no old grudge against the Dark Tower, carries none of the fear that binds every man and elf and dwarf who has spent an age learning to hate him. He asks only this: come east, see what he offers before you bind yourself to lesser lords in golden halls, who will use you and discard you the moment your usefulness ends. And if I say no, then he will ask again," the messenger said, entirely without threat in its tone, which was somehow more unsettling than threat would have been. "He is patient. He has watched ages rise and fall. He can watch you a while longer and ask again when circumstance has made his offer more appealing." Tai Lung considered this, the strange, patient courtesy of it, an offer made without the desperate urgency he'd have expected from a power supposedly at war with the entire visible world. He thought of the Jade Palace, of Shifu's cold refusal delivered again and again across 20 years of imprisoned rage, of the exact particular sting of being told, endlessly, that he was not enough, that he had never been enough, that the thing he wanted most in the world would always belong to someone softer and less hungry than himself. He thought about how good it might feel, for once, to be asked instead of denied. He thought about how good it had felt, for exactly one afternoon on the steps below the Jade Palace, to finally hold the dragon scroll in his own hands, and how it had turned out to be worth nothing at all, a mirror with nothing behind the glass, a lifetime of wanting spent on an answer that didn't exist. "Here's what I've learned," Tai Lung said finally, "about people who offer you exactly what you always wanted, the moment you're most desperate to hear it. They're usually selling something. I don't know your master. I don't know this war. But I know what it sounds like when someone's trying to buy me cheap by telling me I'm worth more than everyone around me thinks. I've heard that pitch before. It wasn't true then either." Something in the quality of the silence that followed suggested the messenger had not expected refusal, or had expected it, and found the manner of it worth noting. "You will change your answer," it said, unhurried, gathering its reins, When this world has shown you what it truly thinks of things it does not understand, it always does. Ask the wolves. Ask the wild men. Ask anything born outside the comfortable circle of what the free peoples call kindred. The bruise-colored horse turned, unhurried, back toward the east road. My master is patient. So am I. It rode away into the gathering dark, and the temperature climbed slowly back toward normal in its wake. And along the wall, Théoden let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. That, the king said quietly, to no one in particular, is not a thing I have ever seen refused so plainly. Éomer, standing at his uncle's shoulder, watched Tai Lung's still profile against the darkening sky, and felt the ground shift slightly beneath his understanding of exactly what, and who, Rohan now sheltered within its walls. Word of the Nazgûl's visit reached Aragorn 3 days later, carried by a rider who had pushed his horse nearly to death crossing the distance between Edoras and the ranger encampment, where Aragorn had been meeting quietly with a company of Dunedain scouts, discussing troop movements out of Isengard that had begun to trouble every watcher along the western borders. He read the account twice before he set it down. A creature falls through a tear in the sky, he said slowly to Halbarad beside him, kills a soldier in what appears to have been genuine self-defense, walks unarmed into Théoden's hall, refuses an offer from Sauron's own emissary without apparent hesitation, and is currently residing as an uncertain guest within Edoras's walls. He looked up. Tell me honestly, old friend, does that sound to you like the beginning of an ally, or the opening move of something far more patient and dangerous than it appears? It sounds, Halbarad said, like something you should see with your own eyes before either of us decides. Aragorn was already reaching for his cloak. Then we ride for Edoras. If Sauron's messenger has already made its interest known, we have less time than I would like to understand what, or who, has landed in the middle of this war. He paused at the tent flap, something old and weary crossing his weathered face. Ages come and ages go, and still this land finds new things to test us with. I had hoped, this once, for a season without one more impossible thing to weigh against everything else we carry. When has that hope ever once been granted you? Halbarad asked, not unkindly, already saddling his own horse. Aragorn didn't answer, because they both already knew there was no answer worth giving. They rode west through the night, and somewhere behind them, in a golden hall on a green hill, Tai Lung stood again at his narrow window, looking east toward the horizon the Black Rider had vanished into, and turned over, with more care than he'd admit even to himself, the shape of an offer he'd refused, without quite understanding why refusing it had felt so necessary, so immediate. So much like the first genuinely free choice he'd made since he'd clawed his way out of Chorgom prison 2 decades and 1 whole world ago. He did not trust kindness easily. He had learned, at great cost, exactly what kindness in this life tended to cost the person foolish enough to believe in it. But something about the Golden Hall, and the fair-haired woman who'd climbed a wall to tell him she recognized his particular exhaustion, and the old king who had weighed him honestly instead of simply condemning him on sight. Something about all of it sat differently in his chest than the patient, hollow courtesy of a voice that had offered him everything he'd ever wanted, in exchange for a war he didn't yet understand, and a master he had every reason to distrust. He didn't know, yet, what he was going to choose, but for the first time in longer than he could remember, he found that he actually wanted to find out. Aragorn and Halbarad reached Edoras at dusk on the 2nd day of hard riding, their horses lathered and blowing, and found the Golden Hall already bracing for their arrival. Word had run ahead of them the way word always did in a kingdom accustomed to watching its borders. Éomer met them at the gate himself. You made good time. A Nazgûl does not visit a king's wall without cause, Aragorn said, swinging down from his horse, dust and road weariness heavy in every line of his face. I would see this creature that refused it, and I would hear, from your own mouth, whether you believe Rohan has gained an ally, or sheltered a threat it does not yet understand. I don't know which, Éomer admitted, walking alongside him toward the hall. I've watched him kill a man without flinching, and stand unmoved before a servant of the Dark Tower in the same 3 days. I've watched my cousin climb a wall to speak with him against every order given her. I don't have an answer for you, Aragorn. I have only questions, and a king growing more uneasy by the hour. They found Tai Lung in the training yard behind the hall, where Théoden had granted him leave to move, under guard, but unrestrained, and where he had spent the better part of 2 days working through forms that left the watching soldiers increasingly unnerved by their precision. He did not stop when Aragorn and Halbarad entered the yard. He simply became aware of them, the way a predator becomes aware of anything new entering its territory, and continued the form he was midway through until it reached a natural close. Only then did he turn. "Another lord come to look at the strange animal," he said, without particular hostility, more weary observation than insult. "Let me guess. You're going to ask me where I'm from, whether I serve the Shadow, and whether I intend violence against this hall. In that order, probably." "Something like that," Aragorn said, unbothered by the tone, studying him with the careful, unhurried attention of a man who had spent decades reading the true measure of strangers before trusting his life to their word. "Though I'd add one question the others may not have thought to ask, which is, what do you actually want? Not what you were denied, not what a voice in a black hood offered you 3 nights past. What you, standing here, actually want out of the time you have in this world." Something shifted, briefly, behind Tai Lung's gold eyes, the particular flicker of someone caught off guard by a question no one had bothered to ask him plainly before. He recovered quickly, folding his arms, expression sliding back toward its habitual cool remove. "That's a strange question from a man I've never met. I've found," Aragorn said, "that it is the only question worth asking, in the end, about anyone. I am called Aragorn. This is Halbarad, kinsman and friend. We are Rangers of the North, Dunedain, if that name means anything to you yet, which I doubt it does. We have spent our lives walking a road that asks a great deal, and offers very little thanks in return. In service of a fight most of the world does not yet understand it is already losing." He crossed the yard slowly, hands visible, no weapon drawn, and stopped an easy 10 feet away. Close enough for honest conversation, far enough to react if reaction became necessary. "I did not come to threaten you. I came because a servant of the enemy rode to this very wall and asked you to join a war on his terms, and you said no, and I find that I would very much like to understand why, before I decide what Rohan, and Gondor, and every free people watching this war unfold, should make of you." Tai Lung studied him for a long moment. "There was something different in this one," he registered slowly. Not the wary caution of Éomer, not the raw, grief-edged pragmatism of Théoden, but something steadier, older in spirit if not in years. A man who had clearly spent a very long time being underestimated by people who didn't understand what quiet competence actually looked like. "I said no," Tai Lung said finally, "because I've spent enough of my life being told I was owed something, by someone who thought flattery would make me useful to them, that I've gotten good at recognizing the shape of it. That thing in the black hood wasn't offering me a war. It was offering me a leash with better manners than the one my own world tried to put on me. I didn't crawl out of one cage to walk straight into another." "And Théoden's hall?" Aragorn asked. "Is that not also, in its way, a cage, watched, escorted, granted freedom only within careful limits?" "It is," Tai Lung admitted, "but your king didn't lie to me about it. He looked at something he didn't understand and told me plainly what he was and wasn't willing to risk. That's different from a voice promising me the world while it measures how much of a leash it'll take to walk me east." He tilted his head slightly, studying Aragorn in turn now, weighing him the way he weighed anyone, instinctively, by the register of their stillness, the balance in their stance, the things a fighter simply knew about another fighter, without needing to be told. You move like someone who's killed people, more than the Boy King's soldiers, more than the Marshal even, for all his bluster. I have killed, Aragorn said, without shame and without relish, more than I would wish, in defense of things worth defending. I do not offer that as a boast. I offer it so you understand I do not come to you as an innocent asking an innocent's questions. Good, Tai Lung said. I don't have patience for innocent questions. Halbarad, who had stood quiet through the exchange, finally spoke. You fought a Nazgûl's presence, and it found nothing to take hold of in you. I have seen grown men, brave men, tested men, buckle under far less than a direct visitation. What is it about you that left no door open? Tai Lung considered the question honestly, which surprised even himself. I spent 20 years alone, he said finally, in a prison, built specifically so I could never escape it. No light, no company, nothing but my own heartbeat and every reason in the world to believe I'd been right to be furious at everyone who put me there. Whatever that thing does, whatever fear it's built out of, I already lived inside worse, for longer, alone, without anyone coming to check on whether I survived it. His voice had gone flat, controlled, the particular careful flatness of someone describing an old wound they'd long since stopped letting show pain. There wasn't room left in me for a stranger's borrowed dread. I'd already built my own, and mine was worse. The training yard went quiet. Even the watching soldiers, who had spent 2 days treating Tai Lung's presence with wary professional distance, found something in the honesty of that answer that shifted, slightly, the shape of what they thought they were looking at. Aragorn studied him a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost its careful diplomatic edge, replaced by something closer to genuine consideration. Middle-earth has fought this war for a very long time, he said, longer than any single life within it, mine included. We have learned, across those ages, that strength alone decides very little. It is what a strength chooses to serve, or refuses to serve, that decides everything. You have already refused Sauron once, plainly, at real cost to yourself, because his offer smelled wrong to something in you that has learned to smell that particular wrongness very well. He paused. I will not pretend that earns you an army's trust in a single conversation, but it earns you mine, provisionally, and I do not offer that lightly to anyone. I didn't ask for your trust. No, Aragorn agreed. But I suspect, somewhere under all that armor you've built around yourself, you'd like it anyway. Most of us would. Tai Lung's jaw tightened, and for a moment something raw and unguarded moved behind his eyes before he shut it down, folding his arms tighter, retreating back behind the cool remove that had carried him through 2 decades of imprisonment and a lifetime of denial. Careful, Ranger, he said low. I don't need anyone reading me like an open scroll. Then stop leaving it open, Aragorn said, not unkindly, and turned to go, Halbarad falling into step beside him. At the yard's edge he paused, looking back. Gondor will want to know what walked out of that tear in the sky. So, I suspect, will the elves. Lothlorien's borders lie close enough to Rohan's eastern reaches that Galadriel will already have felt something shift in the pattern of things, if she has not already. You should prepare yourself, Tai Lung. Every power in this war that matters will want to look at you before this is finished, some more gently than others. He left the yard without waiting for a reply, and Tai Lung stood alone in the settling dusk, turning the ranger's words over with more unease than he wanted to admit to himself. Every power that matters will want to look at you. He'd spent his whole life being looked at and found wanting. He realized with something uncomfortably close to dread, not entirely sure he was ready to find out what this new world's version of that judgment would feel like. 3 nights later, the elves came. There was no dramatic arrival, no thunder of hooves or torn seam in the sky. Only a quiet, near-silent presence at the edge of Edoras' outer fields, noticed first by the horses, who went still and watchful rather than afraid, an entirely different quality of unease than the raw animal terror the Nazgûl had provoked. Haldir of Lothlorien walked into the light of the watchfires alone, unarmed but for the bow across his back, moving with the particular soundless grace that made every Rohirric guard along the wall feel, briefly, clumsy and loud by comparison. "I come from the Lady of the Golden Wood," he said, when Éomer met him at the gate, "who has felt a wound open in the pattern of things that she does not recognize, and who wishes to understand its shape before it grows large enough to threaten the borders she has sworn to protect. I am told your hall shelters the cause of that wound." He was brought to the same training yard where Tai Lung had spent the better part of a week working through forms under careful watch, and the two studied each other across the firelit space with the particular wary stillness of two creatures each entirely capable of violence, neither inclined to begin it without cause. "Another envoy," Tai Lung said. "Should I start keeping count?" "You may keep whatever count pleases you," Haldir said, unbothered, "though I would caution you against mistaking me for the last servant of the shadow that visited this wall. I do not come bearing offers of dominion. I come to understand what has torn a hole in a pattern far older and more delicate than anything your presence here suggests you grasp yet." "Careful," Tai Lung said, something dangerous edging into his voice for the first time since Aragorn's visit. "I don't like being talked down to." "I am not talking down to you," Haldir said evenly. "I am telling you plainly that the world you have landed in is held together by threads far older than your understanding of it, and that whatever tore you loose from your own world may have frayed more of those threads than you realize. The lady wishes to know how badly. That is all. I have no interest in your pride, only in the truth of what you are, and what your arrival may yet unravel." Something in the elf's flat, unhurried honesty struck differently than either the messenger's patient courtship or Aragorn's careful diplomacy had. There was no attempt to flatter him here, no attempt to win him, only cold, precise assessment, the specific quality of scrutiny that reminded Tai Lung, uncomfortably, of exactly how Shifu had once looked at him, weighing worth against a standard that never seemed to bend no matter how hard he fought to meet it. "And if your lady decides I'm dangerous," Tai Lung said, low, "what then? Does Lothlorien send its own army to hunt me down the way I imagine that Black Rider's master might?" "The lady does not act in haste," Haldir said, "and she does not act out of fear, as lesser powers do. If she judges you a danger to the pattern, she will say so plainly, and Middle-earth will decide together what must be done. If she judges you something else, a thread that might yet be woven into the pattern rather than torn free of it, then that too she will say plainly." He studied Tai Lung a moment longer, something almost like curiosity moving behind ancient eyes. "I would advise you, stranger, to consider carefully what you wish to be woven into, before every power in this war finishes deciding for you." He turned to go, and paused at the yard's edge, echoing, without knowing it, the exact shape of the warning Aragorn had left behind 3 nights before. "You have refused the shadow once," Haldir said. "That speaks to something in you worth understanding further. But refusal alone is not the same as choice, stranger. Sooner or later this world will ask you to choose, plainly and finally, what you actually stand for, and I would think carefully, before that day comes, about what answer you intend to give." He vanished into the dark beyond the watchfires as silently as he'd arrived, and Tai Lung stood alone again in the training yard, the weight of 2 warnings, one from a ranger, one from an elf, each entirely different in tone and entirely identical in substance, settling heavy and unfamiliar across his shoulders. He had spent his whole life certain of exactly what he wanted, right up until the moment he'd finally held it in his hands and discovered it was worth nothing at all. Now, for the first time since that hollow afternoon on the Jade Palace steps, he found he genuinely did not know what he wanted next. Only that, somewhere in the golden hall behind him, a fair-haired woman who understood exactly what it meant to be caged by other people's expectations was waiting to see what he chose, and that her opinion, against every instinct he'd spent a lifetime building, had started to matter to him more than he was entirely comfortable admitting. The attack came 5 days later, in the gray hour before dawn, and it did not announce itself with horns or war cries the way Rohan's enemies usually did. Tai Lung woke to the specific, wrong stillness of a night gone too quiet. No owls, no wind through the grass, the horses in their stables holding an unnatural silence that told him, before any alarm had sounded, that something was already inside the walls that shouldn't be. He was moving before the first scream reached him. He found the source in the eastern courtyard, 3 Uruk-hai, black-armored and heavy with muscle, moving through the shadows with a discipline that marked them as something more organized than the raiding parties Rohan's soldiers had described fighting in years past. They'd already put down 2 guards, quick and efficient, and were working their way toward the hall itself with the focused purpose of a strike team that knew exactly what, or who, it had been sent to find. "You," the lead Uruk said, spotting him across the courtyard, and something in its guttural voice carried an ugly satisfaction. "Saruman said you'd be easy to spot." "Saruman," Tai Lung repeated, unhurried, rolling his shoulders. "Another lord I haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet. You won't need the pleasure. He just wants you brought in, alive, if it's convenient." The Uruk grinned, yellow teeth bared. Wasn't told it had to stay convenient. They came at him together, 3 trained killers moving with coordinated tactical precision, exactly the kind of disciplined violence that had carved a bloody path through every army Rohan had faced in living memory. It didn't matter. Tai Lung met the first strike with a redirect that turned the Uruk's own momentum into a joint lock that ended with a wet snapping sound and a scream cut short by a follow-up strike to the throat. The second came in low, trying to take his legs out from under him with a tactic clearly drilled for fighting something faster and lighter than a man, and Tai Lung simply wasn't where the strike expected him to be, already airborne, already descending with both feet driven into the creature's spine hard enough to end the fight in a single motion. The third hesitated, just for a heartbeat, watching 2 trained killers die in under 5 seconds. And that heartbeat of hesitation was the only mercy Tai Lung offered, before closing the distance and finishing it. By the time Éomer arrived at the courtyard, sword drawn, half the garrison rousing behind him in a chaos of shouted orders and hastily donned armor, the fight was already over. Tai Lung stood amid 3 broken bodies, breathing controlled and even, not a mark on him. "Saruman," Tai Lung said, before Éomer could ask. "Apparently your white wizard wants a word too. Sent these 3 to collect me." Éomer's face had gone hard and pale in the torchlight. Isengard has never sent raiders this deep into the mark unchallenged. If Saruman is willing to strike directly at Edoras for you. He didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. Then your king's hospitality just got a lot more expensive, Tai Lung finished for him. Théoden's council convened before dawn had fully broken, torches still burning against the pale early light, and the mood in the hall had shifted from cautious curiosity to something closer to alarm. 3 raiders, Théoden said, pacing before his high seat, sent not to burn, not to pillage, but specifically to take 1 guest from within my own walls. This is no longer a matter of curiosity, Tai Lung. This is a matter of you being a prize worth striking directly at my hall to claim. "I didn't ask to be a prize," Tai Lung said, arms folded, standing at the center of the hall where he'd stood a week before as a stranger, and now stood as something the king clearly wasn't sure how to categorize anymore. "No," Théoden agreed, "but you are one regardless, and that changes the calculation for every soul sheltering under this roof. Isengard knows you're here. If Saruman is willing to send raiders once, he will send them again. Larger, better prepared, perhaps under cover of a strike meant to draw my garrison elsewhere first." He stopped pacing, looked directly at Tai Lung with the particular weariness of a king who had already buried too many men for causes less complicated than this one. "I do not say this to cast you out. I say it because you deserve to understand plainly what your presence here now costs my people, so that whatever you choose next, you choose it with full knowledge of the price." Something in that honesty, the total absence of manipulation in it, the king simply laying the truth bare rather than trying to bend Tai Lung toward a decision, struck harder than any of the arguments the messenger or Saruman's raiders had offered. "What would you have me do?" Tai Lung asked. "Quieter now. Leave. I would have you decide," Théoden said, "what you actually intend to be in this war. A guest under my roof, accepting the risk that comes with sheltering here, and offering something of value in return for it, or a wanderer who moves on before the cost grows too heavy for either of us to bear." He sat back down slowly in his high seat, the weight of the crown settling visibly across his shoulders. "I will not force that choice from you, but I will tell you, plainly, that Rohan cannot continue absorbing this cost indefinitely without knowing what it is buying." Éowyn, standing near the hearth, watched this exchange with an expression Tai Lung couldn't quite read. Not fear, not quite hope either. Something more complicated caught between the two. He thought of Shifu's voice, cold and final, denying him the one thing he'd spent his whole life training for. He thought of the black-hooded messenger's patient courtesy, offering him everything in exchange for a leash he'd have spent the rest of his life fighting against. He thought of Aragorn's steady, unhurried question, "What do you actually want?" and realized, standing in the Golden Hall with 3 dead Uruk-hai cooling in the courtyard outside, that he still didn't have a complete answer, but he had part of one. "I'm not interested in being anyone's prize," he said finally. "Not Saruman's, not the Shadows, not even yours, old man, roof or no roof. But I'm also not interested in running from a fight just because it costs something." He looked around the hall, at Théoden's weary honesty, at Éomer's guarded respect, at Éowyn's careful, watchful attention. "You gave me the truth instead of a leash. That's worth more to me than anything the Shadow offered. If Isengard wants to come collect me, let them come. I'll make sure it costs them a great deal more than 3 dead raiders next time." Something eased, fractionally, in Théoden's weathered face. "That is not nothing, stranger. But it is also not yet an answer to what you fight for, only what you refuse to be taken as." "Give it time," Tai Lung said. "I'm still working that part out." Éowyn found him that evening on the practice field, alone, working through forms in the fading light, with the same relentless discipline he'd carried since his first hour in Edoras. "You could have left," she said, without preamble, settling onto the low fence at the field's edge to watch. After the council, most guests, told plainly that their presence endangers a whole kingdom, find somewhere else to be endangering instead. I've never been most guests. He didn't break the form, though his attention had clearly shifted to her the moment she arrived. "Besides, I told your uncle the truth. I'm not interested in running." "Why not?" The question came sharper than she'd intended, and she softened it a fraction. "You owe Rohan nothing. You didn't ask to fall through that tier onto our plains. You could walk east, walk west, disappear into some corner of this world no one's charted yet, and let all of us sort out our own war without you." Tai Lung finally stopped, turning to face her fully, something raw moving behind the careful cool of his expression. "I spent 20 years in a hole in the ground," he said, convinced the whole world had decided, collectively, that I wasn't worth trusting with anything, that the only thing I was good for was being locked away until I stopped being a problem. His voice had gone low, controlled. The particular flatness that meant something underneath it was anything but calm. "Your uncle looked at me. A stranger, a killer, something out of legend he had no framework for, and told me the truth instead of a lie designed to control me. Do you understand how rare that is?" "How long it's been since anyone bothered?" Éowyn held his gaze, unflinching. "I understand it better than you might think. I know you do." Something almost gentle entered his voice, an unfamiliar register he hadn't used with anyone since he'd arrived in this world. "That's part of it too." The admission hung in the evening air between them, more honest than either of them had quite intended, and for a long moment neither spoke, the only sound the wind moving soft through the grass beyond the practice field's fence. "I am not something to be won," Éowyn said finally, quiet but firm, by a warrior looking for a cause to attach himself to. If that's what this is, it's not that. He said it fast enough, certain enough that she believed him. I've spent my whole life being told what I'm allowed to want. I'm not interested in deciding what I want here based on anything except actually wanting it. He held her gaze steadily. I don't know yet what this war asks of me. I don't know if I'm the kind of thing that fits into songs about golden halls and horse lords and shining swords, but I know I'd rather find out standing next to people who told me the truth than kneeling to something that only offered me flattery. Éowyn studied him a long moment, something shifting behind her pale eyes. Not quite trust, not yet, but the careful, deliberate loosening of a guard she'd held rigid against every man who'd ever tried to tell her what she was allowed to be. Then stay, she said, and mean it, because Rohan has buried enough men who changed their minds halfway through a war to know exactly how much that costs. I don't change my mind halfway through anything, Tai Lung said. Ask the men who tried to take me by force. Ask the ones who are dead because of it. A ghost of something almost like a smile crossed her face, sharp, unimpressed by the boast, and entirely charmed by the confidence underneath it anyway. That's either the most reassuring thing you've said since you arrived or the most alarming. I haven't decided which. Give it time, Tai Lung said again, echoing his answer to her uncle, and this time there was something almost warm underneath the words. I'm still working a lot of things out. They stood together at the fence's edge as the light failed fully into evening, and somewhere far to the west, in the Black Tower of Orthanc, a wizard who had already lost 3 of his best raiders turned his gaze toward Edoras and began, with cold and patient calculation, planning exactly how much force it would take to finish what those 3 had failed to start. And somewhere further still, in a land of ash and fire that Tai Lung had not yet even glimpsed, a messenger delivered its report to a master who did not often ask twice, and received in answer only a long and terrible silence that promised the next offer would not be nearly so gentle as the first. Saruman's second strike came 11 days later, and this time it did not come as 3 raiders slipping through the dark. It came as a column. The scout who brought word to Edoras had ridden 2 horses to death covering the distance, and the account he gave Théoden's hastily assembled council left the hall in a silence heavier than any Tai Lung had yet witnessed within its walls. 200, my lord, perhaps more, Uruk-hai out of Isengard, moving fast and disciplined, no baggage train slowing them. This is a raid built for speed, not conquest. They're 3 days out, maybe less if they push the pace they've kept so far. The scout's hands shook around the cup of water someone had pressed into them. And my lord, they're not moving toward the border villages. They're moving straight for Edward's, straight for the hall. 200 Uruk-hai, Éomer said slowly, sent not to burn a kingdom, but to take one creature from within it. Apparently I'm worth the investment, Tai Lung said, and there was no humor in it now, only a grim, calculating weight settling behind his gold eyes. Théoden's face had gone the particular gray of a king doing arithmetic he did not like the answer to. I can muster perhaps 300 spears in the time we have. Riders mostly. Good in the open field. Less so defending a fixed position against a force built for exactly that kind of assault. If they come in strength and in earnest, Edoras may hold. It may also fall, and every soul within these walls with it. The hall erupted into the low, urgent murmur of a council already fracturing into competing plans. Riders sent to outlying villages to muster more spears. Arguments over whether to meet the column in open ground or hold behind Edoras's walls. Whether word should be sent to Gondor for aid that could not possibly arrive in time. Tai Lung listened to all of it with the particular stillness of someone doing a very different kind of calculation. Send the riders, he said finally, cutting through the noise, and something in his flat, certain tone brought the hall gradually quiet. Muster what spears you can. But don't plan this fight as though I'm a prisoner you're defending. Plan it as though I'm a weapon you're pointing. Théoden studied him carefully. Explain. 200 Uruk-hai crossing open ground, moving fast, no baggage train. That means no heavy formation discipline built for a siege. They're built to hit hard and grab their target before a real defense can organize. Tai Lung's mind was already running through the shape of it, the old cold calculation that 2 decades in a stone hole had honed sharper than any blade. If your riders meet them in open field with me standing in the middle of the line, they'll throw everything at breaking through to reach me, and every soldier around me becomes a target they have to go through first. That's not a fight you win. That's a fight where I watch good men die trying to protect something that doesn't need protecting. Then what do you propose? Éomer asked, an edge of genuine curiosity cutting through his wariness for the first time since the whole ordeal began. Let them think they're getting what they came for. Tai Lung looked around the hall, gold eyes moving from face to face, and for the first time since he'd fallen through the tear in the sky, something in his bearing shifted from guest to genuine participant. Set your riders in the hills flanking the eastern approach, out of sight, ready to close the trap once the column commits to the field. I'll be standing alone in the open when they arrive, exactly where they expect their prize to be, exactly as vulnerable as they'll assume I am, a cold, humorless smile. And then I'll show them precisely how badly Saruman miscalculated the price of collecting me. Silence held the hall for a long moment. You would stand alone, Théoden said slowly, against 200, as bait for a trap sprung by riders you've known less than a fortnight. I've stood alone against worse odds for longer reasons than this, Tai Lung said. At least this time, it's a choice I'm actually making instead of one made for me. Éowyn, who had stood silent through the entire exchange, finally stepped forward, something fierce and unyielding in her pale eyes. Then I ride with the flanking force. If he stands alone as bait, someone should be close enough to close that trap the moment it's needed, not trusting it to distance and timing alone. Éowyn, Théoden began, the old, weary refusal already forming. I have trained with spear and sword since I was old enough to hold either, she said, cutting him off with a directness that made half the hall go still. You have kept me from every field that mattered, uncle. Out of love I do not doubt, and a caution I have grown tired of accepting. This is not a battle fought with banners and open charges where you can claim my safety matters more than my use. This is a trap, sprung from concealment, requiring exactly the kind of controlled discipline I have spent my whole life being told I possess, and never once been allowed to prove. Let me prove it. The hall held its breath. Théoden looked at his niece for a long, searching moment, the particular look of a man weighing grief he had already carried too much of against a stubbornness he recognized, uncomfortably, as his own. Éomer commands the flanking force, he said finally. You ride within it, under his command, and you do not break formation early no matter what you see happen in that field. Do you understand me? I understand, Éowyn said, and the fierce, grateful look she shot toward Tai Lung across the hall said considerably more than her formal acceptance of the king's terms. The column arrived on the 3rd day exactly as the scout had predicted, a black tide of Uruk-hai moving across the golden grass with disciplined, terrible speed, banners of the White Hand snapping above their ranks. Tai Lung stood alone in the open field before them, arms loose at his sides, utterly still, precisely where a prize awaiting collection should stand. The lead Uruk, larger than the rest, scarred, carrying himself with the particular brutal confidence of a commander who had never once failed a mission, raised a clawed hand, and the column slowed to a walk, then a stop, forming a wide crescent around the lone figure waiting for them in the open. Saruman said you'd fight, the commander called, voice carrying flat and ugly across the field. Said you'd make it interesting. I plan to, Tai Lung said. 200 against 1 isn't interesting. It's just math. Funny, Tai Lung said, rolling his shoulders. I was about to say the same thing. The commander's confident grin faltered, just slightly, at something in the certainty behind those words. And in that half-second of hesitation, horns sounded from the hills flanking the field, and 300 Rohirric spears came pouring down the slopes in a thundering wall of horseflesh and steel. Éomer at their head, Éowyn riding hard beside him with a spear leveled, and her pale hair streaming loose from beneath her helm. The Uruk column, caught mid-formation, mid-confidence, suddenly found itself the trapped thing rather than the trapper, and in the chaos of that realization, Tai Lung moved. He crossed the space to the Uruk commander in a handful of strides too fast to properly track, and the fight that followed was not a fight so much as a demonstration. Every strike thrown with the flat, economical precision of 2 decades obsessive discipline, every counter finding the exact gap in armor or stance that a lesser fighter would never have located under pressure. The commander was strong, disciplined himself, clearly no stranger to combat, and it did not matter in the slightest. Tai Lung ended him in under a minute and turned immediately into the chaos of the wider battle. A blur of white and gray and black claws moving through Uruk ranks that had come expecting an easy collection and found instead a slaughter closing in from 3 directions at once. Éowyn fought at Éomer's flank with a controlled ferocity that silenced, permanently, every doubt any soldier in that charge had carried about her place in it. Her spear finding throats and joints with the precision of someone who had trained for this moment her entire life, and never once been allowed to prove it until now. The battle broke within the hour. What remained of the Uruk column scattered, fled, or died where they stood, and as the last echoes of combat faded into the settling dust, Tai Lung stood amid the field's wreckage, breathing hard for the first time since he'd arrived in this world. Blood, not entirely his own, though some of it was, one in this fur. Éowyn found him there, dismounting from a horse lathered with exertion, her spear still red, her pale eyes bright with something that hadn't been there before. Not triumph exactly, but the particular fierce satisfaction of someone who had finally, after a lifetime of being told to wait behind, proven precisely what she was capable of. "You bled," she said, taking in the shallow gash along his shoulder with a critical eye. "So did you," Tai Lung said, nodding at the spatter across her armor. "None of it hers. None of this is mine. Good." A rare, unguarded ghost of something almost like approval crossed his face. "You fought like you'd been doing it your whole life, instead of just training for it in secret." "I have been doing it my whole life," she said, "just never where anyone would let me prove it counted." She looked around at the field, the dead, the scattered wreckage of Saruman's second failed attempt to claim him, and then back at Tai Lung, something settling and resolute in her expression. "You could have died today, standing alone in that field, trusting a trap you'd known about for 3 days, and a king's niece you'd known for less than a fortnight. I've trusted people less, and been right to. I've trusted people more, and been wrong." He met her eyes steadily. This felt like the kind of trust worth the risk. Éomer approached from across the field, blood and dust streaking his face, something in his bearing that hadn't been there before either. The particular grim respect of a soldier who had watched an ally prove himself in exactly the terms soldiers understood best. 200 cent, he said, surveying the field's wreckage, and not one made it back to report the failure to Isengard. Saruman will feel this loss. He looked at Tai Lung with something that, a fortnight ago, would have been impossible. Genuine, unreserved respect. You fought for Rohan today, not for yourself, not to prove a point to Saruman or the Shadow in the East, for us. Don't get used to it, Tai Lung said, though the edge in his voice had softened considerably. I still haven't decided what I'm fighting for, long term. No, Éomer agreed. But today you decided who you're not willing to let die for nothing. That's not nothing either. They rode back to Edoras as the sun set behind them, the golden hall glowing warm and welcoming on its hill for the first time since Tai Lung's arrival. And somewhere far to the west, in a black tower built for schemes far more patient than a single failed raid, a wizard who had now lost 203 Uruk-hai to a single crossover creature began, with cold and mounting fury, reconsidering entirely the scale of force he would need to finish what he'd started. And somewhere further east still, in a land where the very air burned with old and patient malice, a different kind of attention, one that had waited quietly through 2 failed attempts by lesser powers to claim what it wanted for itself, finally began, with terrible and deliberate patience, to stir. The days that followed the battle on the eastern field settled into something Tai Lung had not expected to find in this world. Not peace, exactly, but a kind of provisional belonging he hadn't let himself want since long before Chorgom's dark had swallowed 20 years of his life. He trained with Rohan's soldiers in the mornings, not as a spectacle to be watched warily from a distance, but as something closer to a teacher, correcting stances, showing a young rider how to redirect an opponent's weight instead of meeting it head-on. He ate in the hall in the evenings, no longer seated apart under guard but among the officers, Éomer's grudging respect having settled, over the days, into something closer to genuine camaraderie. And in the hours between, more often than either of them entirely admitted aloud, he found himself in Éowyn's company, on the practice field, along the walls at dusk, in conversations that ranged from old grief to old ambition and circled, again and again, around the particular shared understanding of 2 people who had each spent a lifetime being told what they weren't allowed to be. It was, against every instinct, 20 years in the dark had carved into him, dangerously close to happiness. Théoden watched all of it with the careful, weighing attention of a king who had learned not to trust good fortune too quickly, and he was proven right to withhold that trust on the 14th night after the battle, when the temperature across all of Edoras dropped without warning, and every soul in the Golden Hall felt, simultaneously, the particular crawling wrongness of being observed by something vast and patient and very, very far away. Tai Lung felt it hit him like a physical blow, not the crude, testing pressure the Nazgûl's presence had thrown against him weeks before, but something infinitely larger, an attention that felt less like a mind reaching toward him and more like a mountain slowly turning to notice a single stone at its base. He was on his feet before he understood why, moving through the hall's corridors toward the outer wall with an urgency that pulled Éomer and a half-dozen guards in his wake, and he reached the parapet in time to see the eastern sky, clear, star-scattered a moment before, darken with a slow, spreading shadow that had no visible cloud behind it, no natural cause a soldier's eye could name. "What is that?" Éomer breathed, and for the first time since Tai Lung had known him, real fear had crept into the marshal's voice. "That," Tai Lung said, low, "is the thing your messenger works for," finally deciding to introduce himself. The pressure that had brushed against him weeks ago, testing for a door, returned now in a form that made the earlier attempt feel like a child's tentative knock. This was not testing. This was evaluation. Vast, cold, and utterly without hurry. A presence that had watched ages rise and fall and had simply, finally, decided that the strange thing which had refused its messenger and slaughtered 200 of Saruman's Uruk-hai without apparent effort was worth a more direct accounting. "You refused my servant," the pressure said. Not words exactly, but something that arrived in Tai Lung's mind with the same crushing weight and left no possibility of mistaking its meaning. "You refused my messenger's offer, and you spent your strength defending a kingdom of men that will not remember your name in 3 generations, no matter what songs they sing of you tonight." Tai Lung stood rigid at the parapet, every muscle locked against the sheer scale of the attention bearing down on him, and found, buried somewhere beneath the crushing weight of it, the same stubborn, immovable core that had carried him through 20 years of isolation and denial. "I refused it," he said aloud, voice steady despite everything, "because it smelled like every promise I've ever been given by someone who thought I was too angry to notice I was being used. You are strength without a home," the pressure continued, unmoved by the defiance. "Strength these men will use until it no longer serves them, and discard the moment it does not. I do not discard what serves me, I elevate it. I have watched kingdoms rise on strength I chose to elevate. I could watch you rise higher than any of them ever have, not as a weapon on a leash, as you told my messenger you feared, but as something this world has never once seen, a power answering to nothing but its own will, wearing my favor as armor rather than chain. For one long, terrible moment, standing on that cold parapet with Éowyn's hand suddenly gripping his arm, she had come, he realized distantly, had followed him up onto the wall despite every instinct that should have kept her far from whatever this was. Tai Lung felt the old, familiar hunger stir in his chest, the hunger that had driven him through 20 years of imprisoned rage, the hunger that had cracked the walls of Chorgom itself, the promise of being elevated, finally, after a lifetime of being told he wasn't enough. He thought of the dragon scroll, unrolled at last on the steps below the Jade Palace, reflecting nothing back at him but his own face. He thought of every voice that had ever told him what he was owed, and how completely, utterly hollow every single one of those promises had turned out to be the moment he actually reached for them. "No," he said, and this time the word came out with the full, unshakable weight of 20 years' hard-won clarity behind it. "I already spent a lifetime chasing something I was promised would make me whole. I got it. It was empty. I'm not doing that again for a voice I've never even seen the face of." The pressure did not withdraw immediately. It lingered, vast and cold, weighing the refusal with the same patient calculation it had presumably applied to every offer it had ever extended, and had refused across the long ages of this world. "Then you will watch," it said finally, "as this kingdom that has claimed your loyalty for 2 failed songs worth of battles learns exactly what it costs to shelter something I have decided I want. I am patient, creature. I have outlasted greater defiance than yours. When Rohan burns for the choice you have made tonight, remember that I offered you a different ending, and you chose this one instead." The shadow in the east withdrew as slowly as it had gathered, the crushing weight lifting from the air by degrees, until the stars overhead were simply stars again, and the ordinary cold of a Rohirric night replaced the deeper, wronger cold that had held the wall in its grip. Tai Lung stood rigid at the parapet for a long moment after it was fully gone, breathing hard, Éowyn's hand still gripping his arm, Éomer and the guards around them pale and shaken in the returning starlight. "He threatened Rohan," Éomer said finally, voice unsteady. "Directly, because of you." "He threatened Rohan," Tai Lung corrected, low, "because I said no to him twice in a month, and things that powerful aren't used to hearing that word." He turned to look at Éomer fully, something hard and resolved settling behind his gold eyes. "I'm sorry. I didn't ask for this fight to become your fight, but it already is, and I won't pretend otherwise just to make either of us feel better about it." "You could still leave," Éowyn said, though her hand hadn't loosened on his arm, and her voice carried none of the conviction the words should have held. "Walk east, walk west. Let his attention follow you somewhere it costs Rohan nothing." "I could," Tai Lung agreed, "but I already told your uncle I don't run from a fight because it costs something. That wasn't a boast I made to sound impressive in a hall full of strangers. I meant it." He looked at her steadily, something raw and unguarded moving behind the careful cool he'd worn like armor since the moment he'd arrived in this world. "And I'm not leaving you to face whatever comes next without me standing in the middle of it." Something shifted in Éowyn's expression. The fierce, careful walls she'd built across a lifetime of being underestimated and overprotected in equal measure, cracking just slightly at the edges. "Then we prepare," she said, "for whatever he sends next. Because that was not a bluff, Tai Lung. That was Sauron himself, deciding personally that Rohan's defiance has become worth his direct attention. Nothing in Rohirric memory has drawn that kind of notice, and lived long afterward to speak of it." Below them, in the hall, Théoden had already begun summoning his council, word of the Shadow's visitation spreading through Edoras like cold water through cracked stone, and somewhere far to the east, in a tower of iron and fire that had stood watching this world for ages beyond counting, a will that did not often extend a second chance began, with patient and terrible deliberation, to plan exactly what it would take to make an example of a kingdom that had chosen wrong. Théoden's council convened before dawn, and this time no one in the hall pretended the threat was anything less than existential. Sauron himself, Théoden said, pacing before the cold hearth, has taken a personal interest in punishing Rohan for one guest's defiance. In all the years I have ruled this mark, I have never once heard of the Dark Lord extending his direct attention to a single kingdom over a single refusal. We are no longer dealing with Saruman's ambition, or opportunistic raiders testing our borders. We are dealing with the full weight of Mordor turning toward Edoras, and I do not know if these walls, or these spears, are enough to meet it. Then we do not meet it alone, Aragorn said. He had ridden back to Edoras 2 days prior, drawn by the same rumors of Saruman's failed raid that had reached every corner of the western lands by then, and his presence in the council now carried a weight it hadn't held on his first visit. Gondor must be told. Théoden rides for Minas Tirith within the hour, if you will permit it, my lord. Denethor will not commit his forces lightly, but he will not ignore a warning that Sauron himself has turned his personal attention toward the mark. That is precisely the kind of movement his spies will already be reporting, whether we send word or not. And if Denethor decides Rohan's trouble is Rohan's alone to bear, Éomer asked, bitter with the memory of every slight Gondor's steward had shown Rohan across the years of uneasy alliance. Then we prepare regardless, Théoden said, and hope that when the true weight of this war falls, as it inevitably will across every kingdom eventually, Gondor remembers that Rohan stood first against a threat that might otherwise have grown unchecked. He turned to Tai Lung, who stood at the center of the hall in the same place he'd stood as a stranger weeks before, now regarded by every soul present with a complicated mixture of gratitude, wariness, and something approaching genuine reliance. And you, what do you make of what we face? Tai Lung considered the question carefully. I've fought powerful things before. Nothing on the scale of what spoke to me on that wall last night. But scale isn't the only thing that matters in a fight. He's patient. He told me so himself. Twice now. Once through his messenger and once directly. Patient things don't rush a killing blow. They build toward it, testing, probing, wearing down whatever stands in the way before they commit everything. He looked around the hall. At faces braced for a war none of them had fully understood they were fighting until a fortnight ago. That buys us time. Not much, but some. Time to do what? Éomer asked. Time to make Rohan cost more to break than he currently thinks it will, Tai Lung said. He threatened to burn this kingdom to make an example of my refusal. That only works as a threat if breaking Rohan is actually easy. Make it not easy. Muster every spear the mark has. Send to every outlying village, every hold in the hills. Call them all home to Edoras, or to whatever ground you choose to make a stand on, because when he does move in earnest, it won't be 200 raiders testing a wall. It'll be everything. Théoden studied him for a long moment. You speak like someone who has planned for a war of attrition before. I've spent most of my life planning to survive things that wanted me broken, Tai Lung said. This isn't so different. Théoden rode for Minas Tirith that same morning, and in his absence, the work of preparing Rohan for a war none of them had asked for began in earnest. Riders sent to every corner of the mark, outlying holds abandoned in favor of consolidated defensive positions. The slow, grinding labor of readying a kingdom for a siege that might come in a week, a month, or a year, no one could say with any certainty. Tai Lung threw himself into the work with the same relentless discipline he'd applied to every fight of his life, training soldiers late into the evening, walking the wall's defenses with Éomer to identify weaknesses a purely human eye might have missed, and increasingly, in the quiet hours after the day's labor ended, finding himself in Éowyn's company in a way that had stopped being coincidental weeks ago and had become, without either of them formally acknowledging it, something closer to a choice they were both making deliberately. You've changed, she told him one evening, the two of them seated on the outer wall, watching the last light fade over the plains, the same plains he'd walked alone and friendless not 2 months before. Since the wall, since Sauron spoke to you directly. Have I? You fight the same, move the same, But there's something underneath it now that wasn't there before. She studied his profile in the dying light, careful and searching. When you first came here, I think you were still deciding whether any of this mattered enough to fight for. I don't think you're deciding that anymore. Tai Lung was quiet for a long moment, turning her observation over with the same care he'd have given a genuine tactical assessment. I spent 20 years, he said finally, believing the only thing that would ever make me whole was one specific thing I was told I could never have. I finally got it. It broke something in me instead of fixing it, because it turned out the thing I wanted was never actually going to fill whatever was hollow in me to begin with. He looked at her directly, something open and unguarded in his gold eyes that he'd shown almost no one since his arrival. I think somewhere in the last 2 months, I stopped looking for something to fill that hollow place and started actually living instead, training soldiers who used to fear me, standing beside a king who told me the truth instead of using me, sitting on a wall at dusk with someone who understands exactly what it costs to be told, over and over, what you're not allowed to be. His voice had dropped, quieter now, more honest than he usually allowed himself to be. That's not nothing, Éowyn. That might be the first thing in my entire life that's actually been worth having, instead of worth chasing. Éowyn held very still, something bright and careful moving behind her pale eyes. That is either the most honest thing you've said since you arrived, she said softly, or the most dangerous. I still haven't decided which. Maybe it's both, Tai Lung said. Most things worth having usually are. She didn't pull away when his hand found hers on the cold stone of the wall, and for a long moment they sat together in the settling dark, two people who had each spent a lifetime being told what they weren't allowed to want, quietly deciding, without needing to say it aloud, that they were done accepting that particular lie. It was Aragorn who broke the fragile peace of the following weeks, arriving at Edoras's gate on a lathered horse with news that had clearly cost him considerable effort to outrun. Isengard's forces are moving, he reported to the hastily assembled council, dust and urgency thick in his voice. Not raiders this time, an army. Saruman has broken every restraint he's shown in this war so far. He's emptied Isengard's forges and pits both, sent every Uruk-hai and wild man he's bred or bought, marching toward the fords of Isen, and my scouts report he means to crush Rohan's western defenses before turning east toward Edoras itself. How many? Théoden asked, already rising from his seat, the old soldier's instinct for a coming battle sharpening every line of his weathered face. 10,000, Aragorn said, and the number landed in the hall like a physical blow. Perhaps more. An army built not merely to punish one kingdom's defiance, but to erase it entirely before Sauron's own attention need be spent finishing what Saruman started. The hall fell into a stunned, heavy silence, broken finally by Tai Lung's low, flat voice. He said he was patient, he said, more to himself than to the room. I should have realized patient doesn't mean slow. It means he was already building this before he ever spoke to me on that wall. Théoden looked around his council, at Éomer's grim readiness, at Aragorn's steady resolve, at Éowyn's fierce and unshaken determination, at the strange, powerful creature who had fallen from the sky 2 months prior, and had, somewhere in the weeks since, become something closer to kin than guest, and drew himself up to his full height, the weariness of the past days replaced, finally, by the hard, clear purpose of a king who had spent his whole reign preparing, without fully knowing it, for exactly this moment. Then Rohan rides to meet them, he said, at the fords of Isen, with every spear the mark can muster, and we make Saruman's 10,000 pay a price steep enough that even Sauron himself takes notice of the cost. He looked to Tai Lung. Will you ride with us? You already know the answer to that, Tai Lung said, and for the first time since he'd fallen through the tear in the sky, there was no hesitation in it at all, only the full, settled certainty of someone who had finally, after a lifetime of searching, found something worth standing and fighting for. The muster took 4 days, and by the time Rohan's assembled spears rode west toward the fords of Isen, Théoden had raised nearly 4,000, riders and footmen both, every hold and village that could spare a fighting hand, a force that looked formidable against any enemy Rohan had faced in living memory, and looked, against the 10,000 marching down from Isengard, like a stone thrown at a landslide. Tai Lung rode at the column's flank, matching the horse's pace on foot with an ease that had long since stopped surprising anyone who'd watched him move. Éowyn beside him on horseback despite Théoden's last, half-hearted attempt to keep her from the field, an argument he'd finally abandoned somewhere in the 4 days of preparation, worn down not by her persistence alone but by the plain fact that Rohan needed every capable spear it could field, and pretending otherwise now would cost lives that argument couldn't afford. "You're quiet," Éowyn observed, riding close beside him as the column crested a low rise and the fords came into distant view, a wide, shallow crossing of the river Isen, the far bank already dark with the first advance elements of Saruman's approaching horde. "I'm counting," Tai Lung said. "Counting what?" "How many of them I can put down before this fight decides itself one way or the other." His gold eyes tracked the distant enemy line with the flat, focused calculation of a fighter measuring an opponent far larger than himself. "It's not a comforting number." "Then don't count it," Éowyn said. "Fight it instead. Numbers only matter until the fighting starts. After that, it's just what you do with what's in front of you, one motion at a time." Something in the simplicity of that struck him harder than any tactical assessment could have. "That's either very wise," he said, "or very reckless." "Ask me again after the battle," she said, and there was a ghost of dark humor in it that reminded him, not for the first time, how much steel actually ran under her careful composure. They made camp on the near bank as evening fell, cook fires kept deliberately low, Théoden and his captains working through the night to settle the shape of the coming fight, where to hold the crossing, where to place reserves, how to make 4,000 spears account for themselves against 10. Tai Lung spent the last hours before dawn not resting, but moving through the camp, checking positions, correcting stances one final time, offering what quiet reassurance he could to soldiers who understood, better than most armies in history, exactly what odds they were about to face. He found Éomer alone at the river's edge in the deep hours before dawn, staring at the dark water with the particular stillness of a commander doing the arithmetic no one wanted to say aloud. "If this goes badly," Éomer said, without turning, "I want you to get her away from the field, however you have to. I don't care what she says, what oath she swears at me for it. I've buried enough kin in this war. I won't bury her too, not for want of someone fast enough and strong enough to physically remove her from a battle she's determined to die proving herself in." Tai Lung considered this for a long moment. "I won't lie to you and promise that," he said finally. "She'd never forgive either of us for it, and I don't think I could live with myself, taking that choice away from her the way everyone else in her life already has." He looked at Éomer directly. "But I'll fight beside her the whole battle, every moment of it, and I promise you this, nothing gets through me to reach her while I'm still standing. That's the only promise I can honestly make." Éomer studied him a long moment in the dark, and something passed between them. Not quite friendship, but the particular hard-won respect of two fighters who had each, in their own way, learned exactly what it cost to protect the people who mattered. "That will have to be enough then," Éomer said finally. "It will be," Tai Lung said, with a certainty that left no room for doubt. The battle began at first light, when Saruman's horde surged toward the crossing in a black tide of Uruk-hai and wild men, war drums pounding a rhythm that shook the very ground beneath Rohan's braced lines. Théoden held the center himself, banner raised high, and gave the order that sent 4,000 spears forward to meet a force nearly 3 times their number, with the particular grim resolve of soldiers who understood exactly what they were riding into and had chosen, each of them, to ride into it anyway. Tai Lung broke from the line the moment the enemy vanguard reached the ford, moving into the deepest press of the fighting with a speed and precision that turned the crossing's shallow water red within minutes. He fought without pause, without visible fatigue, every strike economical and final, carving a path through Uruk ranks that had never once faced anything capable of matching him. And around that path, Rohan's soldiers rallied, pressing forward through the gap his violence tore open, holding ground that should, by any honest accounting of the numbers, have already been lost. Éowyn fought at his flank exactly as she'd promised, her spear finding gaps in armor with the trained precision of someone who had spent a lifetime preparing for a moment everyone else had told her she'd never be allowed to have. And more than once, in the chaos of the crossing, Tai Lung caught himself angling his own strikes not merely to kill, but to clear space around her, an instinct he hadn't consciously chosen and couldn't quite make himself regret. The battle raged for hours, the ford running red, bodies choking the shallow water until the crossing itself became treacherous with the wreckage of the fighting. And slowly, inevitably, the sheer weight of Saruman's numbers began to tell. Rohan's lines, brilliant and disciplined as they'd fought, were simply too few against too many, and by midday Théoden's captains were shouting the first warnings of a flank beginning to buckle under sustained pressure from a second Uruk column that had crossed further downriver, threatening to encircle the whole of Rohan's beleaguered force. "We're gonna lose the ford," Éomer shouted, fighting his way to Tai Lung's side through the chaos, blood streaking his face from a shallow cut above one eye. "If that flank collapses fully, we're surrounded. There'll be no orderly retreat, just a rout. And a rout against this many means every soul on this field." Tai Lung's mind raced through the shape of the battlefield with the same cold, focused clarity that had carried him through every desperate fight of his life. How far to the fortress at Helm's Deep? A half-day's hard ride. Less, if we abandon the wounded to buy speed, which I will not order. Then don't order it. Buy the time instead. Something had settled behind Tai Lung's gold eyes. The particular terrible calm of a fighter about to spend everything he had on a single desperate gambit. Get Théoden to sound the retreat toward the deep. I'll hold the ford myself long enough for the column to disengage in good order. Alone? Against a full flank column? I've held worse ground alone before. A grim, humorless smile. Go. Every minute you argue with me is a minute I'm not buying you. Éomer looked at him for one long, searching moment, weighing the madness of the plan against the plain fact that he had no better one to offer, and then turned and rode hard for Théoden's position, shouting the order to disengage even as he went. Tai Lung turned back toward the ford, toward the surging black tide of the encircling flank column, and planted his feet in the churned red water with the absolute, unshakable resolve of someone who had already decided, somewhere in the desperate arithmetic of the last few minutes, exactly what this moment was going to cost him, and had chosen to pay it anyway. Éowyn, fighting her way back toward him against the current of the retreating column, understood what she was looking at with a sick, sudden clarity. "No," she said, reining her horse hard against the tide of retreating soldiers. "No, you are not staying here alone. Someone has to buy the time," Tai Lung said, without looking away from the approaching flank. "It has to be someone the column can't afford to leave half-finished chasing, or they'll just redirect around me and catch the retreat anyway. It has to be me. Then I stay with you." No, he finally looked at her, and everything he hadn't said across the past 2 months, everything he'd only begun, in the quiet hours on the wall, to let himself feel, was suddenly, nakedly present in his gold eyes. "I promised your brother nothing gets through me to reach you while I'm still standing. I intend to keep that promise. I can't keep it if you're standing beside me instead of riding away from this." Tai Lung. "Go," he said, and it wasn't a request. "Live. Whatever happens here, live, and I'll find you on the other side of it, one way or another. I didn't come this far, didn't finally find something worth fighting for, just to watch you die proving a point about staying." The flank column was close now, close enough that individual Uruk faces were visible, close enough that there was no more time for argument. Éowyn held his gaze one more agonized moment, tears she refused to let fall bright in her pale eyes, and then wheeled her horse and rode hard for the retreating column, because some part of her understood, even through the fury and the grief of it, that arguing further would only cost them both the thing he was trying to buy with his own life. Tai Lung turned back to face the flank column alone, planted his feet in the bloody water of the ford, and let 20 years of imprisoned discipline and 2 months of hard-won purpose settle into a single, absolute readiness. "Come on, then," he said, low, to no one and everyone. "Let's see what this costs you." The column crashed into him a heartbeat later, and the ford at Isen became, for the space of the next desperate hour, the site of a single fight that would be sung of, though he didn't know it yet, and wouldn't have cared if he had, for as long as Rohan kept its songs. There is a particular kind of fighting that has nothing left in it but survival. No strategy beyond the next strike, no plan beyond staying upright long enough to throw one more blow. And Tai Lung had lived inside that particular kind of fighting once before, for 20 years, in the dark, with nothing but his own breath and his own fury to keep him company. He found it again at the fords of Isen, and discovered, somewhere in the first unbroken hour of it, that everything those 20 years had built into him was, at last, being spent for a reason worth spending it on. The flank column hit him in waves, dozens at a time, and he met each wave with the same flat, economical violence that had carved through Saruman's first 200 raiders. But there was no room here for the clean efficiency of that earlier fight. This was attrition, pure and grinding. A war of inches fought in bloody water against an enemy that did not stop coming, and by the second hour his shoulder was bleeding freely from a glancing axe blow he hadn't quite avoided in time. His breath had gone ragged in a way it hadn't been since the earliest days of his training under Shifu. And still the column kept coming, because Saruman's Uruk-hai had been bred and driven for exactly this. Relentless, tireless, indifferent to their own losses so long as the objective was eventually achieved. He did not think about Éowyn, because thinking about her threatened to cost him the one thing he could not afford to lose in this fight: absolute focus. He did not think about the Jade Palace, or Shifu, or the hollow ache of a dragon scroll that had promised him everything and delivered nothing. He thought only about the next strike, and the one after that, and the one after that, because that was the only arithmetic that mattered anymore. He lost track of how many he'd killed somewhere past the second hour. He lost track, somewhere in the third, of how much blood he'd lost himself, the world narrowing to the immediate press of bodies and steel, and the ragged, burning effort of every breath. He was still standing when the column's commander, a massive scarred thing that had held its own soldiers back through 2 hours of slaughter, watching, calculating, waiting for the moment its quarry finally faltered, finally stepped forward itself. "You fight well, for something so far from home," it said, circling him with the wary respect of a predator that had watched enough of its own kind die to understand exactly what it was approaching. "Saruman wanted you alive. I begin to think that was never a realistic order." "Then don't follow it," Tai Lung said, voice ragged but still, underneath the exhaustion, entirely unbroken. "Come find out what happens when you don't." The fight that followed was the hardest of Tai Lung's life. The commander was fast, strong, and disciplined, in a way none of the rank-and-file Uruk-hai had been, and Tai Lung was fighting it on legs that had already spent 3 hours holding a crossing alone, on reserves that had already been spent twice over. They traded blows that would have ended lesser fighters in the first exchange, the commander's blade opening a long gash across Tai Lung's ribs, Tai Lung's claws finding the gap in the commander's armor at the throat, only after taking 2 more wounds to get there. The commander fell. Tai Lung did not, though it was close. Close enough that he found himself on one knee in the bloody water afterward, breath tearing at his chest, the world narrowing and blurring at its edges, in a way that some distant, clinical part of his mind recognized as the beginning of the body simply running out of what it needed to keep going. The remaining column, leaderless and shaken by the sheer cost of an hour spent failing to bring down a single opponent, hesitated. And in that hesitation, horns sounded from the west, and the thunder of returning hooves rolled across the ford. Éomer had not, it turned out, simply led the retreat to Helm's Deep and left it at that. He had gotten Théoden's main column safely away, settled the wounded and the reserves under Théoden's direct command at the fortress gates, and then turned back himself, against every order and every instinct of self-preservation, with every rider he could convince to follow him, because he had made Tai Lung a promise on that riverbank in the dark hours before dawn, and some promises, once made, simply could not be abandoned. The returning riders crashed into the remaining flank column's rear with the desperate fury of soldiers who had already resigned themselves to arriving too late, and found, instead, one final chance to matter, and what remained of Saruman's encircling force broke and scattered within minutes, fleeing back across the ford in the fading light. Éomer found Tai Lung still on one knee in the bloody water, surrounded by a killing ground that would be spoken of for generations, barely conscious, held upright by nothing but the same stubborn refusal to fall that had carried him through 2 decades in the dark. "You absolute fool," Éomer said, dismounting fast, catching him before he finally, fully collapsed. "You held this alone for 3 hours. Told you," Tai Lung managed, the words barely more than a rasped breath. "I've held worse ground. Not like this. Not this long. Not against this many." Éomer's voice had gone rough with something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, the particular raw emotion of a man who had genuinely expected to find a corpse, and had found, instead, something worth calling a miracle. "Éowyn will." He stopped himself, some instinct telling him this was not the moment for that particular conversation. "She's safe," Tai Lung said, the words costing him everything he had left. That's the only thing that mattered." He lost consciousness fully a moment later, and Éomer, holding the weight of him with a care that surprised even himself, understood in that instant precisely what kind of thing had fallen through that tear in the sky 2 months before. Not a monster, not a weapon, not even, quite, the proud and solitary warrior who had first stood on that eastern ridge refusing to name himself. Something that had learned, somewhere in the 2 months since, exactly what it meant to fight for people instead of for himself, and had very nearly died proving it. He woke 3 days later in a small chamber at Helm's Deep, the fortress's ancient stone walls cold and close around him, bandages wrapped tight across his shoulder and ribs, and the first thing he became aware of, before the pain, before the fog of whatever herbs the healers had used to keep him unconscious through the worst of it, was Éowyn's hand gripping his, her head bowed against the edge of the narrow bed, exhausted in a way that spoke of days spent at his side rather than hours. "You're an idiot," she said, without lifting her head, the moment she registered the change in his breathing. "The single greatest idiot I have ever had the misfortune to care about. I bought you the time," Tai Lung said, his voice a rough whisper. "You needed to get everyone to safety. Seemed worth the risk. You nearly died." She lifted her head finally, and the raw, unguarded fear still visible in her pale eyes told him exactly how close nearly had actually been. 3 hours alone against an entire flank column, and you call that a risk worth taking, as though it were a minor wager instead of your entire life. "I told you I'd find you on the other side of it," he said, "one way or another. You could have found me dead of grief instead," she said, though the fierceness in it had already begun cracking into something softer, more raw. "Do you understand what it did to me, riding away and leaving you there? Do you understand what I would have carried the rest of my life, if Éomer hadn't turned back?" "I understand," he said quietly, "because I've carried that particular weight myself. Every choice I made for 20 years, in the dark, was about surviving something I couldn't control. This was the first choice I've made in longer than I can remember that was actually about protecting something instead." His hand tightened, weak but certain, around hers. "I'd make it again, every time, even knowing what it cost." Éowyn held his gaze for a long, searching moment, and then, very carefully, mindful of his wounds, leaned down, and pressed her forehead against his, something between them settling into place that neither of them needed to name aloud to understand completely. "Rest," she said finally, quiet. "The war isn't finished. Saruman's main host is still marching, and Théoden means to make his stand here, at these walls, whether you're healed enough to stand with us or not. You'll need whatever strength you can recover before that comes. How long do we have? A day, perhaps 2. Her voice had gone grim again, the fierce tenderness of a moment ago tempering back into a soldier's hard resolve. 10,000, marching on a fortress that's never held more than a few hundred at once. Théoden believes we can hold it. I believe we have no choice but to try." Tai Lung closed his eyes, drawing on reserves he wasn't certain he still had, and found, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the pain of wounds that would have killed a lesser fighter outright, the same stubborn, unbreakable resolve that had carried him through every desperate hour of his life so far. "Then I'll be standing," he said, "when they arrive, whatever it costs." Outside the fortress walls, the last light of evening faded over the mountains, and somewhere out in the dark, 10,000 strong and marching without pause, Saruman's full host closed the distance toward Helm's Deep, entirely unaware that the single greatest obstacle to their victory had already, in the span of 2 desperate months, become something Rohan would not surrender without a fight that history itself would remember. The healers argued against him rising at all, and Théoden himself came to the chamber the following evening to say, plainly, that no one within the fortress would think less of him for sitting this battle out after what the fords of Uisen had already cost him. Tai Lung was on his feet by the time the king finished speaking, wounds bound tight beneath fresh wrappings, movement stiff and visibly costly but present nonetheless. "I appreciate the concern," he said. "I don't need the permission." Théoden studied him for a long moment, this strange, fierce creature who had fallen from the sky as a stranger and stood now, 3 months later, willing to bleed out a second time for a kingdom that wasn't originally his own, and something like genuine affection moved behind the old king's weary eyes. "No," he agreed finally, "I don't suppose you do." The host arrived at dusk the following day, 10,000 strong, filling the valley below Helm's Deep in a black tide that stretched from one rocky wall to the other, war drums and torches turning the whole approach into something out of nightmare. Inside the fortress, perhaps 1,000 defenders, soldiers, old men, boys barely old enough to hold a spear, every soul Rohan could still muster after the ford, braced along walls that had never been tested against a force, even a fraction of this size. Tai Lung stood on the deeping wall beside Éomer, Éowyn positioned within the Hornburg's keep with the wounded and the very young, a placement she'd fought bitterly against and finally, grudgingly, accepted only when Théoden had pointed out, with a bluntness that had clearly cost him, that someone capable needed to hold the last line if the outer defenses failed entirely, and he trusted no one more than his niece to make that final stand count. "Doesn't look like a fight we win," Éomer said quietly, watching the torch-lit host assemble below. "Most of the fights worth remembering weren't ones anyone expected to win," Tai Lung said. "That's usually what makes them worth remembering." The assault began with a crash of ladders and grappling hooks against ancient stone, and the night dissolved into hours of desperate, grinding combat along walls that had stood for centuries and had never once faced a test like this one. Tai Lung fought through the worst of it with wounds still healing beneath his bandages, every strike costing more than it should have, and still he held his section of the wall against wave after wave of Uruk-hai with the same unbreakable stubbornness that had carried him through the ford 3 days before. The wall broke, eventually, not through any failure of the defenders but through sheer overwhelming numbers, a section of ancient stone finally giving way under sustained assault, and the battle became something closer to a desperate, fighting retreat toward the Hornburg's inner keep, every foot of ground bought at terrible cost. It was in the chaos of that retreat, the keep's gates barely holding against the surging tide outside, that Tai Lung found himself separated from Éomer's main force, cut off in the outer courtyard with a dwindling handful of soldiers and a wall of Uruk-hai between himself and the safety of the inner keep. "Go," he told the soldiers around him, already turning to face the press of enemies pouring through the broken section of wall. "I'll hold this ground long enough for you to reach the gate." "Not again," one of the younger soldiers said, recognizing with dawning horror exactly what shape this moment was taking. "Not alone. Not like at the ford." "I don't have time to argue about it," Tai Lung said, already moving, already meeting the first wave of the breach with the same flat, economical violence that had defined every fight of his life. "Go." They went, reluctantly, and Tai Lung turned to face what remained of the courtyard's defense alone, wounds burning, breath already ragged, and found, in the deepest, most exhausted part of himself, one final reserve of stubborn, unbreakable will. He fought for what felt like an eternity, though it was likely only minutes, holding a choke point in the broken wall against a tide that should have overwhelmed him within seconds, buying every second he could for the retreat behind him. And it was there, in the deepest and most desperate moment of that fight, exhausted and wounded, and entirely certain he had finally found the fight that would end him, that the first gray light of dawn broke over the eastern ridge above the valley. And with it came Gandalf. The wizard arrived on the ridge with a force of riders Théoden had believed lost, the white light of his presence turning the dawn itself into something like a physical weapon, and the Uruk-hai host, caught between the fortress's desperate defenders and a charge descending from the high ground at first light. Broken, scattered in the space of minutes, the tide of the battle turning with a suddenness that left even Tai Lung, bleeding and exhausted in the wreckage of the courtyard, briefly uncertain he'd survived to witness it. He had. He sank to his knees amid the scattered dead as the battle dissolved into rout around him, the fortress's defenders pouring out to finish what the charge from the ridge had begun, and found himself, for the second time in a handful of days, simply too spent to do anything but breathe. Éowyn found him there as the sun rose fully over the valley, picking her way through the wreckage of the courtyard with a fear she didn't bother hiding, and the sound she made when she finally saw him, bloodied, exhausted, but unmistakably, miraculously alive, was not quite relief, and not quite grief, but something that held both at once. "You did it again," she said, dropping to her knees beside him, hands moving over his wounds with a healer's practiced urgency, even as her voice shook. "You held alone, again, and we won," Tai Lung said, the words costing him what little breath he had left, a rough and genuine wonder in them that hadn't been there after the ford. "Éowyn, we actually won. We survived," she corrected, though there was no real argument in it, only the raw, overwhelming relief of someone who had spent the entire battle certain she was about to lose everything that had come to matter most to her. "Rohan survived. Saruman's host is broken. And you," her voice caught, "you are going to stop doing this to me. Do you understand? I cannot keep watching you decide, again and again, that your own life is the acceptable price for everyone else's. I keep surviving it," Tai Lung managed, something almost like humor cutting through the exhaustion. "That is not the reassurance you think it is." He let her help him upright, leaning on her more heavily than his pride would have permitted a season ago, and together they made their way out of the shattered courtyard into a dawn that Rohan had, against every reasonable expectation, actually lived to see. Gandalf found him 3 hours later, once the wounded had been tended and the scattered remnants of Saruman's host had been fully routed from the valley, standing at the fortress's broken outer wall and studying the damage with an expression that suggested he was measuring more than stone. "You are the one who fell from the sky," the wizard said, without preamble, white robes still dust-streaked from the ride. Théoden's riders spoke of little else the entire way here, a creature of unmatched skill, unbroken by a Nazgûl's presence, who has twice now held a choke point alone against odds that should have killed anything mortal. That's a generous summary, Tai Lung said, still favoring his wounded side, though the worst of the pain had settled into something manageable. I nearly died. Twice. That part usually gets left out of the songs. The songs rarely include the parts that matter most, Gandalf agreed, something knowing in his weathered face. I have walked this world a very long age, stranger, and I have met precious few things that Sauron himself troubles to speak with directly, fewer still that refuse him twice, and live to speak of the refusal. He studied Tai Lung with the particular, unhurried attention of someone accustomed to seeing further into people than they were entirely comfortable with. You did not come to this world by chance, I think, though I doubt even you understand yet what pulled you through that tear, or why. I assumed it was just bad luck. Perhaps. Gandalf's eyes carried a weight that suggested he believed otherwise, though he didn't press the point further. What I know with more certainty is this. Saruman's host is broken, but Saruman himself remains, and Sauron's attention, the attention you earned yourself on that wall weeks ago, has not lessened, simply because his servant's army lies scattered in this valley. If anything, this victory will only sharpen it. He does not tolerate defeat gracefully, and Isengard's failure will be laid, in his mind, at your feet as much as anyone's. Tai Lung absorbed this with the flat, weary acceptance of someone who had already understood, on some level, that the war was far from finished, simply because one battle had gone Rohan's way. Then what comes next? Next, Gandalf said, Saruman himself must be answered for, at Isengard, before his broken host has time to regroup or his own schemes find some new and more desperate form. And after that, he paused, something grave settling into his weathered face. After that, I suspect the true weight of this war finally turns toward Gondor, and toward the darkness gathering at the Black Gate itself, in ways that will make everything Rohan has faced so far look like the opening notes of a much longer song. His gaze settled on Tai Lung with quiet, deliberate weight. You have found, I think, something in this land worth fighting for that goes beyond simple survival. That will matter a great deal. Before this war is finished, hold on to it. It may be the very thing that decides how this all ends. He turned and walked back toward the fortress's inner keep, leaving Tai Lung alone at the broken wall with the weight of that warning settling heavy across his still healing shoulders. And behind him, across the valley, the first columns of Rohan's surviving forces began the slow, grim work of tending their dead and preparing for whatever came next, in a war that had only, it seemed, just begun to show its true and terrible scale. Word of the victory at Helm's Deep reached Isengard before Théoden's forces had even finished tending their wounded, and Saruman, watching from the black heights of Orthanc as the scattered remnants of his host straggled back through country he had once controlled absolutely, understood, with the particular cold clarity of a strategist confronting total failure, that his war against Rohan was finished. His war against the creature who had broken it, however, was not. He met Gandalf and Théoden's combined delegation at Isengard's ruined gates 3 days later, the fortress itself already fallen to forces neither wizard nor king had fully anticipated, ancient trees moving with a purpose no living memory could explain, Saruman's once mighty stronghold reduced to a broken shell in the space of a single night. None of them had witnessed, but all had heard whispered about in tones of genuine awe. Tai Lung stood at the edge of that delegation, still favoring his healing wounds, and watched the white wizard emerge onto Orthanc's high balcony, with something between professional curiosity and grim satisfaction. So, Saruman called down, his voice carrying the particular honeyed persuasion Gandalf had warned them all to guard against. The beast that broke my army stands at last where I can see it plainly. His pale eyes settled on Tai Lung with cold, assessing interest. You fought well, creature, better than my finest commanders anticipated. I confess I underestimated the scale of what tore through that seam in the sky. Save the flattery, Tai Lung said. I've heard better from someone with a lot less to apologize for. I don't apologize, Saruman said, something sharp cutting through the honeyed tone. I calculate, and my calculation was wrong. a rare enough occurrence that I find myself genuinely curious what manner of thing could account for it. Sauron himself has taken personal interest in you. Do you understand how singular that is? In all my long study of his ways, I have never known him to extend such attention to anything so recently arrived in this world. I've heard the pitch already, Tai Lung said. Different voice, same offer, more or less. I said no then too. Then you are a fool, Saruman said, though something in his tone suggested he found the refusal more fascinating than infuriating. The war you have chosen to fight for, this kingdom of men, this fading golden hall clinging to relevance in an age that is ending regardless of what any of you do, cannot win, in the end. Sauron's strength grows with every passing season. Gondor crumbles from within even as it postures its strength. The elves are leaving these shores, one by one, weary of a fight they no longer believe they can win. You have thrown in with the losing side of history, creature. Out of what? Sentiment? A woman's regard? I had believed you sharper than that. Something cold and dangerous moved behind Tai Lung's gold eyes. You don't get to talk about her. Ah. A thin, knowing smile crossed Saruman's weathered features. There it is, the thing that actually moves you, laid bare at last. He leaned against the balcony's edge, entirely unbothered by the fury he'd deliberately provoked. I wonder if she understands what she has attached herself to. A creature that spent 20 years, by its own account to my spies, consumed entirely by rage at being denied a single thing it believed it was owed. Tell me, stranger, when this war eventually asks more of you than you are prepared to give, when the Golden Hall burns despite every desperate stand you've made for it, will that same rage find a new target? I have seen it before, in lesser creatures. Denial curdles eventually into something far uglier than simple ambition. Gandalf stepped forward before Tai Lung could answer, something hard and final in his weathered face. Enough, Saruman. You have lost your army, your fortress, and whatever claim to counsel you once held among the wise. Spend your remaining words wisely, or spare us all the tedium of listening to them. Saruman's cold gaze lingered on Tai Lung a moment longer, weighing the fury he'd deliberately provoked with the particular satisfaction of someone who had, despite everything else lost that day, still managed to land one genuine wound. Consider it at least, he said, withdrawing back into the tower's shadow. Every promise this world has made you so far has cost you blood you can scarcely afford to keep spending. Ask yourself, someday soon, what happens when the cost finally exceeds what even you are willing to pay? He vanished into Orthank's dark interior, and the delegation below stood in the ruined courtyard for a long moment, the weight of his words settling uncomfortably over all of them despite the day's undeniable victory. He's trying to poison you against yourself, Éowyn said quietly, appearing at Tai Lung's side, her hand finding his without hesitation despite the audience of Rohirric soldiers and Gondorian scouts around them. That's all that was. He's lost everything else, so he reached for the one weapon he had left. I know, Tai Lung said, though something in his voice suggested the words had landed harder than he wanted to admit. Doesn't mean there's nothing true buried in it. There isn't, Éowyn said, firm and certain. You are not the rage that carried you through Chorgom. You have not been that thing since long before I met you. If you were ever entirely that thing at all, I would know. I have watched you closely enough these past months to trust my own judgment on the matter. He looked at her for a long moment, something in his chest loosening slightly at the plain, unwavering certainty in her voice. You're better at this than I am, at believing good things about myself. Someone has to be, she said, until you learn to manage it on your own. They rode back toward Edoras 3 days later, the victory at Isengard settling into the particular bittersweet weight of a war won in one theater while a far larger one continued gathering strength elsewhere. And it was on the second night of that ride, camped along the eastern road with the stars spread thick and cold overhead, that Aragorn found Tai Lung alone at the camp's edge, still turning Saruman's words over with more weight than he'd let himself show anyone but Éowyn. You're troubled, Aragorn observed, settling beside him without invitation. I keep thinking about what he said, about the cost eventually exceeding what I'm willing to pay. Tai Lung stared out at the dark plains, gold eyes distant. I've bought time with my own blood twice now. Held ground alone because it was the only math that worked. What happens when the math doesn't work anymore? When holding the line costs more than I have left to spend? Then you will have given everything you had for something worth giving it to, Aragorn said simply. That is the whole of what any of us can promise in a war like this one. I have walked this road a great many years, stranger, longer than you would credit looking at me, and I have made peace with exactly that truth a long time ago. We do not fight because we are certain of victory. We fight because the alternative, standing aside, preserving ourselves at the cost of everything worth protecting, is a worse fate than the fighting itself. That's a bleak comfort. It is the only honest one I have to offer. Aragorn's gaze softened slightly. But I will offer you this too, since Saruman clearly tried to take it from you. You did not choose this fight because of rage, or obligation, or even, entirely, because of what you feel for Éowyn, though I don't doubt that feeling runs deep and true. You chose it because somewhere in these past months you found something in yourself that wanted to protect rather than simply survive. That is not the same creature Saruman described. That is something considerably better, and I do not think it is so easily poisoned by one bitter wizard's dying attempt to wound you on his way down. Tai Lung was quiet for a long time, the fire's embers settling low between them, before he finally spoke again. The war's not finished, he said. Gandalf said as much. Sauron's attention hasn't lessened. If anything, Isengard's fall will only sharpen it. No, Aragorn agreed. It will not be finished for some time yet. Gondor's trial is still to come, and I fear it will be the greatest this age has yet demanded of any of us. He looked at Tai Lung steadily. But you will not face whatever comes next alone, unless you choose to. That, I think, is the difference between the world Saruman offered you a vision of, and the one you have actually found here. You have people now who will stand the line beside you, not merely people who need you to hold it for them. Tai Lung thought of Éowyn's certain, unwavering voice, of Éomer turning back against every order to keep a promise made in the dark, of Théoden's plain, unmanipulative honesty, offered freely from the very first night, of a king and a kingdom that had given him, without ever quite intending to, the first genuine home he'd known since long before Chorgom's dark had swallowed 20 years of his life. No, he agreed finally, something settling and resolved in his chest. I suppose I won't. Behind them the camp slept on beneath the cold stars, and ahead, though none of them could yet see its full shape, the true climax of the war that had swallowed a kingdom of men and a stranger from another world entirely, was already, in the dark towers of Mordor, beginning to take its final and most terrible form. Gandalf departed for Minas Tirith within the week, called by grim news that Denethor's grip on Gondor's defense had grown erratic, and behind him he left a warning that settled over Edoras like a shroud. Sauron's full strength was gathering at last, the Black Gate disgorging armies the likes of which this age had not yet seen. And Gondor, proud, weary, ancient Gondor, stood almost alone in the path of it. Théoden convened his council within days of the wizard's departure, and this time there was no debate about whether Rohan would answer the coming call, only how quickly and at what cost. Gondor sheltered our fathers when the Mark was young, Théoden said, standing before his assembled captains with the particular hard clarity of a king who had already made his peace with what this war would ultimately demand of him. If Minas Tirith falls, no wall in Middle-earth will hold long after. We ride the moment the beacon is lit, whatever state our own recovery stands in. Our forces are still recovering from Helm's Deep, Éomer said, though there was no real argument in it, only the plain accounting of a marshal weighing what remained against what would be asked. We rode against 10,000 3 weeks past. We buried more good men than any of us wished to count. If Gondor's need is what Gandalf described, then we go anyway, Théoden said. Because the alternative is watching everything we love burn one kingdom at a time, waiting our turn behind a wall that will not hold once Gondor is gone. He looked around the hall, at faces still marked by the fighting at the ford and the deep, at a kingdom that had given everything it had, and would, apparently, be asked to give more. We are the riders of the mark. We do not abandon those who once sheltered us, however great the cost of standing with them now. Tai Lung, standing at the edge of the council as he had since his very first night in that hall, felt the shape of what was coming settle heavy across his shoulders. "This is it," he said quietly, more to himself than to the room, though Éowyn beside him heard it clearly enough. Everything Aragorn warned me about, everything Gandalf meant, when he said this would make Rohan's trial look like the opening notes of a longer song. "Yes," Éowyn said, her hand finding his without hesitation, the gesture no longer something either of them bothered hiding from the watching hall. "And you'll face it the same way you've faced everything else since you fell through that tier. Not alone, whatever the cost turns out to be." The beacons of Gondor were lit 11 days later, chains of fire blazing across mountain peaks from Minas Tirith all the way to the borders of the Mark, and Théoden gave the order to muster within the hour of their sighting. Every spear Rohan could still raise, riding hard for a city under siege by a force larger than any this age had witnessed. The ride to Gondor took 4 days of relentless pace, and Tai Lung spent most of it in the grim, focused silence of a fighter conserving everything he had for what was coming, Éowyn riding at his side despite Théoden's final, exhausted attempt to keep her from this field too, an argument abandoned almost before it began, both king and niece understanding by now the futility of it. They arrived at the Pelennor fields at dawn on the 5th day, and the sight that greeted them stole the breath from every rider in the column. Minas Tirith's white walls besieged by a black tide that stretched, seemingly without end, across the entire plain before the city. Siege towers, war beasts the like of which Rohan's soldiers had never before witnessed, and above it all, circling on leathern wings, shapes that carried a dread even the bravest riders could feel, settling cold in their chests before they understood fully what they were looking at. "Fell beasts," Éomer said, voice tight, "and their riders, the 9, or what remains of them, given new wings to carry Sauron's will, directly onto the field." Théoden raised his sword, and across the assembled riders of Rohan, 6,000 strong and more than Théoden had believed he could muster only weeks before, a silence fell that held the particular weight of soldiers about to charge into something that would be remembered, one way or another, for the rest of this age. "Now for wrath," Théoden called, his voice carrying clear and strong across the waiting host. "Now for ruin, and a red dawn." 4th Aerlingus, the charge that followed broke against Sauron's host like a thunderclap. 6,000 riders crashing into the siege lines with a fury that scattered the enemy's outer ranks in the first devastating minutes. And Tai Lung fought at the heart of it with everything 2 decades of discipline and 3 months of hard-won purpose had built into him, carving a path through orc ranks that had never once faced anything like him, buying ground with every strike that Rohan's cavalry poured through behind him. The battle that followed was the largest and most desperate Tai Lung had yet witnessed in this world. Hours of grinding, chaotic combat across a field that seemed to have no edge, no natural end, only more enemy pouring in from every direction, as Sauron's full strength finally, fully committed itself to breaking Gondor once and for all. It was in the deepest chaos of that fighting, hours into the battle, that Tai Lung felt the temperature around him drop with a suddenness that stopped him cold in the middle of a strike. The same crushing, wrong cold he'd felt on Edoris's wall months before, except vastly, terribly amplified, descending from directly above. He looked up in time to see the shape of it, a fell beast the size of a small dragon, and mounted upon it, wreathed in shadow and radiating a despair so absolute it staggered soldiers 100 yards distant, the Witch King of Angmar himself, descending directly toward the place where Théoden had fallen only moments before, pinned beneath his own dying horse. King's guard scattered and broken around him. No. Tai Lung's voice tore raw across the battlefield, and he was already moving, already throwing every remaining reserve of strength into closing a distance that seemed, in that terrible frozen moment, impossibly far. He did not reach it in time. He arrived to find Éowyn already there instead, helm cast aside, revealing herself at last, standing alone between the fallen king and the descending horror, with a fierceness that stole what little breath Tai Lung had left. And the exchange that followed happened faster than thought. The Witch King's mace crashing against her shield hard enough to shatter both shield and arm in the same terrible instant. Éowyn crying out and falling even as she drove her blade, in the same motion, up beneath the Witch King's crown with a strength that came from somewhere far beyond simple physical reserve. The Witch King shrieked, a sound that tore across the entire battlefield, ancient and terrible and, at last, ending, and dissolved into nothing. Cloak and armor collapsing empty to the churned earth, and Éowyn collapsed beside it, broken and unmoving. In the same instant, Tai Lung finally closed the last of the distance between them. The world narrowed, for Tai Lung, to the single sight of her still form in the mud, and something in him that had survived 20 years of imprisonment and 3 of the hardest battles of his life came apart completely for the first time since he'd fallen through that tear in the sky. "No," he said, dropping to his knees beside her, gathering her broken, shallow-breathing form against his chest with a care that belied every ounce of violence he'd spent across the last several hours. No, stay with me, do you hear me? Stay." Her eyes fluttered, found his, held on with a fierce and fading effort. "We won," she managed, echoing, faintly, the words he'd once said to her in a different courtyard, after a different desperate battle. "The Witch King, he's gone." "I don't care about the Witch King," Tai Lung said, voice breaking in a way he had never once let it break in this entire world. Not before Sauron's crushing attention, not before Saruman's poisoned words, not before any threat this whole war had thrown at him. "I care about you. Stay with me. That's the only thing I'm asking. Stay." "I'm trying," she whispered, and then her eyes closed, her breathing shallow and ragged, and Tai Lung gathered her fully into his arms and rose, ignoring every wound of his own, ignoring the battle still raging in every direction around him, and began carrying her from the field with the singular, desperate focus of a creature who had, at last, found the one thing in this entire world he was not prepared to lose. Behind him, the tide of the Pelennor fields was already beginning to turn, the Witch King's fall breaking something essential in the coordination of Sauron's assault, Gondor's own forces rallying, reinforcements arriving from the south under banners no one on the field had expected to see. But Tai Lung registered none of it. His entire world narrowed to the fragile, failing weight of the woman in his arms, and the desperate, singular hope that the healers behind Minas Tirith's walls would prove skilled enough and fast enough to give him back the one thing this long and terrible war had finally, truly threatened to take. The houses of healing smelled of Athelas and wood smoke and the particular hush that settles over a place built to hold the space between dying and living. And Tai Lung did not leave Éowyn's bedside for 3 days, refusing every offer of rest, every attempt by healers and soldiers alike to pull him away from the narrow cot where she lay pale and unmoving, her shattered arm bound tight, her breath shallow, but the healers kept insisting, though he barely let himself believe it, steady. It was Aragorn, arriving on the second day with hands that carried a healer's old half-forgotten skill alongside a king's authority he had not yet claimed, who finally broke the fever that had settled over her in the wake of the Witch King's touch, pressing crushed Athelas into water that filled the whole chamber with a scent like spring after long winter, murmuring words in a tongue Tai Lung didn't recognize, and standing back, finally, as the tension in Éowyn's face eased into something closer to true rest. "She will live," Aragorn said, quiet and certain. resting a hand briefly on Tai Lung's shoulder. The wound to her arm was grievous, but the deeper harm, the shadow sickness that follows a blow from one of the nine, has broken. She needs rest and time and someone patient enough to sit with her through both. His gaze held something knowing. I suspect you are equal to that particular task. I'd sit here another 20 years if that's what it took, Tai Lung said, and meant it entirely. She woke fully on the fourth day, and the first thing she saw, blinking against the pale morning light through the chamber's narrow window, was Tai Lung asleep in a chair pulled close against her bed, exhaustion finally having claimed him after days of refusing it, one hand still resting lightly over hers. "You didn't leave," she said, and the sound of her voice, rough but present, brought him awake instantly. "I told you I'd find you on the other side of it," he said, something raw and unguarded in his gold eyes. "I meant it every time I said it." "I killed the Witch King," she said, half wonder, half disbelief, as the memory of the field settled fully back into place. "You did," Tai Lung said, "and very nearly died proving it, which I would appreciate you not making a habit of." A ghost of a smile, weak but genuine, crossed her pale face. Says the creature who's held 2 choke points alone against overwhelming odds in the space of a single month. "Fair," he admitted. "Maybe we're both due for a season of doing something considerably less reckless." The war did not end at the Pelennor Fields, though its true turning had happened there. The Witch King's fall, Théoden's costly victory before his own death claimed him on that same terrible field, Aragorn's slow, deliberate rise toward the throne that had waited, empty, for an age for a king willing to claim it. The Black Gate would come after, and the final desperate gamble that ended Sauron's reign for good, but Tai Lung fought none of that final chapter as a stranger uncertain of his place in this world. He fought it as something Middle-earth had, by then, fully claimed as its own. A warrior of Rohan in every way that mattered, standing beside Éomer, now king of the Mark in his own right, at the Black Gate's final desperate stand, and watching, at last, as the darkness that had tested him from the very first night broke and scattered for good. He returned to Edoras afterward, to a golden hall that had, somewhere across the long months of war, become the closest thing to home he had known since long before a stone prison swallowed 20 years of his life, and to Éowyn, healed and whole and fierce as ever, who met him at the gate with a certainty neither of them needed words to confirm. Saruman had asked him, in that broken courtyard at Isengard, what would happen when this world finally cost him more than he was willing to pay. Tai Lung had an answer for him now, though the wizard would never hear it. Nothing this world asked of him had ever cost more than what he'd already spent 20 years giving away for nothing, in the dark, to a grievance that had never once loved him back. Everything he'd bled for since, a stubborn king's honesty, a marshal's hard-won respect, a woman who understood exactly what it meant to be told what she wasn't allowed to want, had given him back more than it had ever taken. He had come to Middle-earth as a stranger with no name this world recognized, chasing nothing but the last hollow echo of a life spent wanting the wrong thing. He stayed because, somewhere in a golden hall on a green hill, he had finally found the right one.